All right, well, hello YouTube. So I am joined by Lance Bush today. Well, Dr. Lance Bush now, right? You have successfully defended the thesis. So I'm also a doctor. We're two doctors. That makes us both experts. So we are the reliable sources. We are the sources of truth. Um, anyway, what we're going to be doing today is talking about metaethics, and we're going to give a tier list of some of the arguments for moral realism. This is not going to be an exhaustive list of arguments for moral realism. We're just going to look through some of the arguments for moral realism, and we're going to rank them from the best to the worst. That's what's happening in this video. So, Lance, do you have anything you want to say by way of introduction?
Uh, I guess I don't think the last time I was on your channel that I had my channel going yet. So I do have a channel now. So I could, if it's okay, I'll mention it now. It's called Lance
Mm-hmm.
Independent. It's also a blog, also called Lance Independent. So you could check those out. And a lot of it focuses on meta ethics, although I'm starting to shift more into meta philosophy stuff. And I did just finish the PhD, but I should say it's in psychology. So I don't know if I get to claim to be any kind of expert in philosophy.
Okay, well, very well. Um, so yeah, basically, as I said, we're going to be making a tier list of arguments for realism. Now, there is a website called Tier Maker that has these really funky looking lists and everything. But the thing is that in order to use Tier Maker, first of all, you have to like create an account there, and then secondly, you can only use pictures, and I wasn't really sure how to represent all of these arguments with pictures. So this tier list is going to be a lot less sophisticated. It's just a list on a Word document, but doesn't matter. The point is, we'll talk about these arguments and rank them, and I mean, I guess if anybody has encountered either of us before, they know that we're probably both. They probably know that we're both very much on the anti-realist side. Um, but I am going to insist that we make an effort to put some of the realist arguments uh, in the at the top of the list, right? So basically, I should say, yeah, the way this works is there's like six categories. At the very top is S tier, which basically means like the best, and then it goes A, B, C, D, E, and that's from best to worst. I'm not actually sure why the top is S tier, but that's how all of these lists work. I don't know why it goes S A, but it does. So that's what we'll do on this one as well. Um, and yes, that's what we'll do. Okay. So yeah, do you want to get started with it?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, cool. Um, all right. Well, first up then, we have the companions in guilt argument. The companions in guilt argument for moral realism. I guess maybe yeah, we should probably start by saying a little bit about what each of these arguments is. So with the companions in guilt argument, this is a little bit tricky actually, because there are a whole bunch of different companions in guilt argument. The general idea of a companions in guilt argument is going to be that if you are an anti-realist about moral normativity, um, that's going to commit you to anti-realism about other things. And usually the idea would be that it's going to commit you to anti-realism with respect to other kinds of normativity. I think probably the most popular companions in guilt argument would be that anti-realism about morality commits you to anti-realism about epistemic norms. So we don't just make claims like, you ought not to torture people, or uh, it like slavery is wrong. We also say things like you ought to proportion your beliefs to the evidence, or flat Earth theory is unjustified, things like that, right? So we make normative claims with respect not just to what you ought to do, but what you ought to believe. And the charge is that if you are a moral anti-realist, then you're going to be committed to anti-realism about these epistemic norms, and that's supposed to be a pretty significant bullet to bite. Because you're going to end up having to say that, if it looks like if you're an anti-realist about epistemic norms, well, there's not really any fact of the matter, or at least no stance-independent fact of the matter, whether or not flat Earth theory is justified, or whether or not it's rational to apportion your beliefs to the evidence. So that's the challenge, right? Like moral anti-realism is going to commit you to anti-realism about epistemic norms, and anti-realism about epistemic norms is just completely absurd. Do you think that's a fair representation of the argument?
Yeah, roughly. There's probably some nuance one could add to it, but I don't think that doesn't strike me as a mischaracterization. It is typically paired. So I mean, typically there's a sort of parity premise where moral realism is going to stand or fall contingent on whether another type of normative realism stands or falls with it. Typically, the expectation is that people are not going to want to give up that other domain of normative realism, and so they'll be like, all right, well, I guess I can't give up moral realism either.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Okay. So, any particular thoughts on this argument?
I do have a number of thoughts.
Right.
I also am curious where you are going to rank this, because I think I already have a decision, and I'm going to make my decisions before I hear yours. I don't know if we should be willing to adjust them afterwards if we end up disagreeing.
Yeah,
the first thing I'll say about this is that I'm actually fairly sympathetic to the parity premise. The other thing is that, well, I should just say this. I was a normative anti-realist about all normativity prior to ever encountering companions in guilt arguments. And so I remember the first time someone presented one to me, it's like, to me, it felt like someone saying, hold up, you don't believe in Bigfoot? Well, if you're not going to believe in Bigfoot, you would have to not believe in the Loch Ness Monster, and not believe in alien abductions, and not believe in unicorns. And this felt very much the same way. Where I was like, yeah, I don't believe in any of those things. I think they're all absurd, and I don't think there's any good reason to believe in any of them. And I feel the same way about any other category of normative realism, that I don't think there's good reasons or good arguments. Someone might say, reasons. I think reasons could be understood in anti-realist terms. So I didn't find this even remotely compelling. And so the first thing I should say is this argument never had any force with me, simply because I just am totally fine with accepting the parity premise and not concerning myself overly much with any other type of realism. I don't find any of them to be attractive.
Yeah, actually, I was in exactly the same position when I first heard this. I remember feeling somewhat baffled that this had been presented as an argument for realism, because my reaction was just like, well, yeah, I mean, I am already an anti-realist about epistemic normativity. Actually, one of the things that strikes me is that it almost feels like an argument from a kind of weaker case, because, I mean, just speaking for myself here, like I have really quite strong reactions when it comes to at least some moral claims. So if you take something like slavery, I think slavery is just absolutely horrifying. So that provokes this really strong emotional reaction. Now I'm saying I'm an anti-realist about that. Now on the other hand, when you take these claims about epistemic normativity and you say, well, people ought to apportion their beliefs to the evidence, or flat Earth theory is unjustified. I mean, okay, yeah, maybe I'll agree that flat Earth theory is unjustified, but I would much rather live in a world where everybody believes in flat Earth than a world where people are getting enslaved. So it's kind of strange to see. To me, I almost want to say, if I was going to be a realist about any kind of normativity, I guess I would find moral normativity the most appealing, just in terms of how much of a pull I feel towards it. Whereas the epistemic normativity, I can kind of take or leave it. So, I mean, so I don't know. I mean, that's just my reaction. Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to accept the parity premise, and then I'll just say I'm not a realist about epistemic norms. I think that one thing that's worth noting about the companions in guilt argument is that I am not sure. I mean, I guess there are going to be like different ways of framing the argument, but I think that on the most plausible ways of framing it, I'm not really sure that it's even an argument for realism as much as it is an argument like against certain ways of arguing for anti-realism. So, for instance, like anti-realists might make the complaint that moral normativity involves a commitment to like moral realism involves a commitment to some sort of idea of categorical normativity. There's like desire independent reasons for action or whatever, and then this is supposed to be something bizarre or queer, as someone like Mackie would put it. And then the companions in guilt argument can kind of kick in and say, well, it's not just the moral facts that have this supposedly queer feature. Epistemic facts are going to have that queer feature as well. And so that's like that way of putting it doesn't exactly get you to realism. What it gets you is that there are certain arguments for anti-realism that don't work. But that might just sort of leave you with, okay, well, there's no particular argument for anti-realism, but that in itself isn't going to convert you to realism. So I would just wonder like how far the companions in guilt arguments can get you, even if they were successful. But yeah, so for that reason, I would worry about them, at least in the context of persuading people to become realists. But
well, there's a particular thing someone could do if you try to make the move of just saying, okay, well, I'm a sort of global normative anti-realist and I reject epistemic realism, which is that they could say that's not really a position that you could believe or that you could endorse because it's self-defeating. If you reject epistemic realism, then you don't have any reasons to endorse epistemic anti-realism, and so you're not justified in endorsing it. And that might be a kind of objection that could be leveraged. So there's a sort of two-step process that one could imagine someone making. First, they argue for a companions in guilt argument.
mm-hmm.
You reject the argument by accepting the parity premise, and then they say, that's fine. That's one way you could take the argument. And in fact, they could even present it as a dilemma rather than an argument, which is either you have to accept moral realism or you have to accept epistemic anti-realism. And if you go, okay, well, I accept epistemic anti-realism, they could then say, okay, well, now you face the problem of self-defeat. And so the argument can be it could have this sort of like two-tier approach. And then its value could be derived from its role in sort of being leveraged towards that self-defeat argument. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's fine, but so to be clear, when I was sort of suggesting that maybe it doesn't get you all the way to moral realism, the concern is more like this, right? So let's say that moral normativity and epistemic normativity are on a par with respect to the thing that worries the moral anti-realist. So maybe it's that there's a commitment to categorical reasons, and we just say, categorical reasons are queer or they're unintelligible or whatever. So we might say, well, look, you already believe in epistemic normativity. Epistemic normativity involves a commitment to categorical reasons. So what does that mean for moral normativity? Well, that in itself doesn't get... I mean, like, okay, well, now I can say, well, look, the objection that I had to moral normativity maybe doesn't work. But like the mere fact that both of these involve a commitment to categorical reasons, that like, okay, well, that doesn't in itself mean that I have to accept moral normativity. I mean, it would be kind of like if somebody just as an analogy, right? Like, let's say that somebody says that there couldn't possibly be a God because God is supposed to have a mind, and minds are just really weird, right? What the hell is a mind supposed to be? And then someone says, well, hang on a minute, you already believe in people, and people have minds. So what? So you should believe in God? Well, that doesn't really work. I mean, I think that the so there is that the argument that you used against the existence of God isn't successful. But that doesn't.
Oh yeah, I wasn't disputing that. I agree that I think it can expose
mm-hmm.
an inconsistency in the way some anti-realists might leverage objections to moral anti-realism. Like, they might raise an objection that's based on moral realism having certain sorts of characteristics or commitments or properties that they're like, okay, I don't accept those. And then if someone can convince them that other things they do accept also have those properties, they don't have a good argument anymore. They're going to have to either withdraw their objections to realism or add the other things to the list of things they object to in order to be consistent. I'm on board with that. I was just pivoting to another thing that could count in favor of a companions of guilt argument, which is that it could be leveraged for a sort of second order argument, which is that the proponent of the companions of guilt argument could say, look, you can make that move. So we've successfully dispensed with bad, inconsistent anti-realist objections to moral realism in particular. We've got the moral anti-realist on board with rejecting epistemic anti-realism, but now we have a problem that's distinctive to epistemic anti-realism that's not a problem for rejecting moral realism, which is that epistemic anti-realism, to try to endorse that position, is in a certain sense self-defeating or self-undermining. And so the companions in guilt argument can kind of funnel people towards an unattractive position.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, obviously my view is I don't see anything in particular that would make epistemic anti-realism self-defeating. I think it's perfectly sensible to say that I can say, well, I have reasons for my beliefs, and I'm going to cash that out in terms of, well, maybe for instance, I just want to have true beliefs and I want to avoid false beliefs. And then there are going to be ways, or at least there's going to be ways that I take it are more or less reliable at achieving that, or something along those lines, right? So I could just give, I could give an argument to the effect that epistemic anti-realism is correct. I wouldn't have to say that this is an argument which is in some sense like that gives you like a stance independent reason to accept epistemic anti-realism. I could just say, well, if you want to have correct beliefs, all right, here's why I think epistemic anti-realism is correct, and take it or leave it. If you don't want to have correct beliefs, then obviously that's not going to move you.
Right. So I would give basically the same response. And I'm also completely unmoved by these sort of self-defeat responses, because they seem to presume that the conditions for success, like the conditions to avoid defeat, require or call for certain sorts of concepts that I've denied myself. But in addition to denying any type of normative realism, I also deny that the realist concepts that I am sort of, renouncing, that I need those in order to meet some standard of success. Maybe I don't meet the realist conception of success conditions, but I'm rejecting their conception of success conditions outright. I don't care to play the epistemic game by their standards. So what I find strange about these arguments is that they often seem to grant that the anti-realist is capable of rejecting certain components of the realist perspective, but then they sort of try to retain this requirement. Well, okay, you can reject that there are stance-independent epistemic reasons for belief, but if you do that, you still would need stance-independent epistemic reasons to be justified in believing that. You don't have those, so you're not justified in believing that. Well, so much for your account of justification that I don't care about that. I don't think that, it's not just that I'm going to variously say that I have problems with whether I even think that it's true or whether it makes any sense or whether I find it in some sense non-trivial, but I could always just say, okay, well, I endorse some other conception of justification or reasons or whatever, and I succeed on those terms. And what's the problem? And, I'm not that motivated to try to operate within a sort of a sort of circumscribed framework that is presumed to be one in which I must operate, and for which I don't think a good argument has been given in the first place, and that I don't find intuitive, and that I don't think has many theoretical merits in its favor, and that while they might say most ordinary people subscribe to this view, or it's intuitive among ordinary people, I don't think that's true. So I think that a lot of the sorts of appeals that they would want to make for trying to maintain the success conditions that I purportedly couldn't meet, I'm not convinced by any of those either.
Hmm.
I think, though, that this creates, because these sorts of positions are sort of, it's like a layer cake of presumptions, that when you start rejecting all of the presumptions, if you reject one, if you're like, okay, I reject moral realism, um, that's seen as some type of skepticism or a radical view, which I already don't grant. But when you start rejecting, like you peel down back the onion of presuppositions and presumptions that the realist is bringing to the table, and you're like, yeah, I reject that too. And they bring up another consideration, yeah, I reject that too. They can then leverage that to say, well, you're an extreme skeptic. You reject everything. I've given you all these presumptions. I've given you 5 or 6. You reject all of them. This is so you can do that. That's consistent, but it's a radically ridiculous skeptical position. And I think that that itself is a kind of, it's like an argument by implication, that it's like, if I heap enough presumptions at you and you deny them all, that can make you look like you're doing something that is dialectically suspicious.
Okay, yeah. I mean, for what I suppose I mean, to put my own cards on the table, I would just be happy to accept the extreme, radically skeptical implications of this. I'm happy to just throw out justification and truth and all of that. If that's where, you know, this is going to take me, then so be it. I'll accept it. But I yeah, I mean, so okay, yeah. I don't know if maybe we should just sort of come to a decision about where to put this. I think that
Sure.
my feeling is that uh, it's. I don't find it remotely convincing as an argument for moral realism. I think maybe it's useful as a tool for sort of uncovering maybe presuppositions or something that we're making in these debates. And I mean, certainly, it's I mean, look, it seems like there are some people who deny moral realism but do want to maintain some sort of epistemic realism. And, you know, the companions in guilt argument is going to push them to give an account of, well, like, okay, why is it that moral normativity is problematic, but epistemic normativity is perfectly fine, right? So it's not completely useless. I but I'm actually not sure what the sort of standards I should be using for assessing these arguments is.
I
I
was about to raise the same concern. So
right,
we have at least a couple options.
right.
One is to rate them sort of relative to one another.
Hmm.
So whatever one you think is the best might get an S rank, and then whatever you think the worst would get like an E. But we could also try to rate them as with respect to some sort of absolute standard, or like this external standard that is less relativized, which I guess is kind of ironic, given what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Not that I think that implies a realism about the ranking. I'm inclined to go more with the latter, because I think if I'm really honestly assessing them, they all get bad grades. It's just a question of how bad.
Yeah. Well, so as I've mentioned, we're not allowed to put them all in the E tier. There's got to be at least one in the S tier. I will say that with the companions in guilt argument, right? I, First of all, I don't find it remotely convincing. Secondly, I find it a little. Maybe this is just what I've experienced, and maybe it's not fair to judge the argument in as on these terms, but there's so many realists I've encountered who are like so smug about this particular argument that it like annoys me. Like I'm just annoyed about this particular argument. Like they seem to think that they've got this like knockdown response to anti-realism, and I don't know. I think there's a whole bunch of ways out of the companions in guilt argument. So it always frustrates me when it's like presented as though, okay, well that's it. Like anti-realists, you know, game over. You know, you're all committed to like crazy radical skepticism, so that's it, game over. So anyway, I think I would be inclined to put it in maybe C tier. I don't think I could put it any
We
higher
agree
than that.
so far. I went with C.
Oh, cool. Okay, okay. There we are then. Well, I'm gonna type in companions in guilt in C tier. And
Yeah, so I could just say briefly why I would give it C tier and not like a lower grade. So, like you, I don't find it convincing at all. But I think the reason I would bump it up a few points is because I think it moves the dialectic forward. And I think
mm,
that is of substantial value. I think it does put pressure on any moral anti realist that wants to reject epistemic anti-realism or other anti-realist positions. And I think that pressure is significant. I think I would say they should reject all forms of normative anti-realism. They should reject all forms of normative realism. And so I think that at least in that respect, it can move anti-realists in the direction I think they should have gone in the first place. So it does
yeah,
something.
yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, so okay, yeah, it's a useful tool, but it's not necessarily a useful tool in terms of getting us to moral realism, because
Right, and that's because, but this is going to be true of pretty much any argument.
right.
One philosopher's modus ponens is another's modus tollens, and I just tollens where I think they want me to ponens.
Um, yes, okay. Um, So the next one that I have on the list is the deliberative indispensability argument. Now, this comes from David Enoch in his book Taking Morality Seriously. I've I'm just going to read from my notes here because I want to make sure I state the argument correctly. So the argument works like this. So premise one: if X is instrumentally indispensable to an intrinsically indispensable project, we're justified in believing that X exists. Premise two: deliberation is intrinsically indispensable. Three: objective, irreducible normative truths are indispensable to deliberation. So we are justified in believing in objective, irreducible normative truths. And so the basic idea of this is so this idea of instrumental indispensability. Um, we would say that we'd say that the X is instrumentally indispensable to a project, just in case you can't eliminate your belief in X without undermining your reasons for engaging in that project. So, for example, it seems like belief in God is going to be instrumentally indispensable for prayer, right? Like if you're expecting prayer to have any success, it seems like you need to believe in the thing that you're praying to. Um, and then this idea of intrinsic indispensability is there are some types of projects that we just can't avoid doing, like they're sort of non-optional. So with prayer, well, I kind of can, you can avoid doing that, right? I don't pray, it's not a problem. But deliberation looks like something that is non-optional. I have to deliberate. I sometimes have to ask myself, like, what should I do? What should I believe? So I think to myself, like, should I pursue a philosophy PhD? Would that be the best thing for me? And when I do that, when I engage in this sort of deliberative process, I'm trying to discover something. I'm trying to figure something out. I'm trying to get to the right answer. When I ask, should I pursue a philosophy PhD? I don't create the answer. I find it by thinking through reasons for and against doing a philosophy PhD. So there's a fact of the matter which decision it would make sense to make, and deliberation is the sort of tool for revealing reasons for and against the decision. And that's why we're supposed to be committed to believing in objective reasons. I hope I summarized that fairly. I think that's basically the idea.
So
Yeah.
what at what point is there an argument for why the like a belief? So is it that we deliberation requires a belief in objective, irreducible moral properties, or just that they exist?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm not sure that it requires a belief in objective, irreducible moral properties. It's more specifically objective, irreducible normative
Oh, okay.
reasons.
So this is just okay.
Yeah, so actually, this is another case where this argument in itself is, even if it's successful, it's not actually going to get you to moral realism. It will get you to normative realism, but it won't get you to
Right.
moral
Okay.
realism.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But is it? I was just I couldn't recall exactly what you said about the particular premise. Is it that you have to believe in them or they have to exist?
You have to believe in them, um, because so if you think about something like prayer, um, if I do not believe in God, then it wouldn't make sense for me to pray to God. Or at least
Right.
I
Okay.
wouldn't be
Got it.
able
Got
to
it. Got
say
it.
that I expect it to be successful, right?
Okay. Yeah. I don't know why I even asked because that's got to be what it is. And I think when you discussed this before, I think you did a video on this where you raised one objection, and someone could say, "Well, just because you believe in it doesn't mean it's got to exist." Isn't that one potential reply? And then Enoch has a reply to that.
Yeah, I think so. I can't remember the exact details of what Enoch said,
Okay.
but I do have a video on it.
Got
Yes,
it.
so if people are interested, they can go and see that for more information.
Yeah, so I'm not inclined to make that move.
Mm.
I'll just grant that maybe Enoch has a good reply to that particular move. I guess I'm not quite sold on how it's the case that I'm required to believe in these irreducibly normative facts in the first place. Why are those required for deliberation? That I'm not understanding why that's the case.
Yeah, so as I understand it, the idea is so okay. Let's say that I'm deliberating about whether or not to pursue a philosophy PhD, right? And in doing this, I have to consider. I mean, there's various things I'm going to consider. I'm going to consider my desires and what would best satisfy those desires, and that question obviously is just sort of descriptive, right? So if I have a particular goal and then I try to figure out, well, what would best satisfy that goal, that's just going to be a descriptive, like a descriptive claim. There's no need to believe in normativity there, at least as far as I know. Um, so so the thought is that in cases of deliberation, although although it's going to appeal to my desires, we can't just identify reasons with desires, um, because, well, the idea would be something like this. One option would be to say that the fact that an action will satisfy your desires counts as a reason to do it, because it matters that your desires are satisfied. But if you say that, well, that's the that claim is then the desire independent normative truth. So uh, it matters that your desires are satisfied, or the fact that an action will satisfy your desires counts as a reason to do that action. Um, that claim is then going to be the objective, irreducibly normative truth. Um, so reasons are not going to be fully reduced to desires. On the other hand, if you say that having a reason, like there's just nothing more to having a reason than having desires, then I think Enoch's concern is that um, it's going to turn out that reasons are problematically arbitrary. So your desires, like you can just have desires for, they can just sort of happen, right? Like I just have whatever desires I have. Um, but it seems like I can deliberate not just about what to do or what to believe. I can also deliberate about those desires, and so the desires in themselves are just going to be these arbitrary things. And the point of deliberation is to remove that kind of arbitrariness. That does that make any sense at all? Does that? Yeah.
Uh, so I could see why the first one would be a problem, and
Hmm.
I certainly wouldn't make that move. It's just going to just bring some type of normative realism in through the back door. So I'm not going to
Yeah.
go with that. The second one, not really sure I'm getting. Like, what is the problem with arbitrariness? I'm just not seeing what the problem is.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. So the claim that Enoch wants to make, as I understand him, is that the point of deliberation is to remove arbitrariness, right? Like, it's like we could make decisions just on a whim, but we have this thing, this project, let's say, called deliberation, which allows us to remove the arbitrariness of making decisions just on a whim. Um, so instead of like flipping a coin to decide whether or not to do a philosophy PhD, I think through the reasons for and against it. And that process is supposed to lead me to the right answer, or at least to a non arbitrary answer. Whereas if you say that reasons are merely desires, then it's going to turn out that reasons are ultimately just arbitrary. And so deliberation obviously wouldn't be able to remove arbitrariness in that case.
Yeah, I guess I'm just so I would want to get super clear on what is meant by arbitrariness. And, I might be concerned that arbitrariness, there's at least two different types of arbitrariness, and there might be some kinds of arbitrariness I wouldn't be okay with. But the fact that I desire some things over others, if someone wants, and then I'm motivated to act accordingly, and then when I deliberate, I'm trying to act in accordance with achieving my goals or my desires, whatever they happen to be. If someone says, okay, but your desires are arbitrary, okay, that doesn't trouble me. I'm not bothered by that. But the other thing I'd just say is I don't take it to be the purpose of like the purpose of deliberation to minimize arbitrariness. I take the purpose of deliberation to be to figure out how to get what I want. That's all I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't particularly care. Like I want what I want. I don't. Someone saying, but what you want is arbitrary. What? So what?
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be like there's different kinds of arbitrariness, right? I mean, so I might be thinking to myself, should I do a philosophy PhD? And then I just flip a coin, and I don't put any further thought into it. Um, that's one kind of arbitrariness. And then there's like, let's say there's a process of maybe I shouldn't call it deliberation, liberation, if you don't want to call it deliberation. But then I could be sitting down and sort of thinking to myself, well, I really enjoy philosophy. I like writing philosophy articles. I want to learn more about it. On the other hand, philosophy PhDs don't get paid very well. I'd like to earn money. So I'm kind of weighing up these things, and it seems like my desires there could just be arbitrary. So maybe my desire to pursue maybe my love of philosophy is just completely arbitrary, and my desire to earn money is just completely arbitrary, right? I don't have any further reasons for them. But I mean, so what? It looks like I have those desires, and now, given those desires, I can sort of weigh things up in light of those desires. Um, that seems relevantly different from the case of just flipping a coin. If you want to call them both arbitrary, all right, fine. Then maybe I'll just say that I'm okay with making arbitrary decisions.
Yeah, I would reject the former because I don't want to use decision-making procedures that are not optimized for achieving my goals. But in the latter case, if I'm simply trying to decide what would in fact facilitate achieving my goals, saying that the goals themselves are arbitrary, I guess I don't even know I'm not entirely sure what exactly that means, but insofar as I can make sense of it, I don't feel the force of that. It doesn't seem like a problem to me. Maybe they are arbitrary.
Yeah, I think
So
I think I feel
basically, my
similar.
reaction to this argument so far is that it looks like I can either contest the conception of deliberation on offer and just deny that deliberation needs to have the sorts of things that Enoch seems to attribute to it, or, and I think I've seen other people make this move, if someone wants to say, look, just analytically, or just as a matter of like what the nature of deliberation is, this is what it's about. I could just say I'm fine with dispensing with deliberation, and then I might go back and reject that deliberation is indispensable, and then I can engage in schmiliberation,
Right.
and and then I'll engage in some type of schmiliberation where the only factors that are relevant to the decision making process to this schmiliberating are facts about what's consistent or inconsistent with like goal success or my desires, and then that's what I'm doing, and arbitrariness is just not a factor there.
Um, yeah, okay. I think I pretty much I feel the same way. And another point I would make about this particular argument is I wonder like even if we were to accept all of the steps of it, um, I can't help but feel like, okay, so what is it that I'm sort of left with? Well, I guess I'm left with the idea that like when I'm deliberating, I have to believe that there are these objective, irreducible, normative truths. Um, but but then like it's so it seems like I could draw a distinction between sort of I don't know everyday contexts and the kind of context of like sitting in a philosophy seminar room talking about these kinds of arguments. Like, so it might be the case that I would have an account where, like, well, yeah, maybe when I engage in everyday deliberation, I just have to believe in these objective normative truths. But then, like, why does that mean that when I'm assessing a philosophical argument, why would that mean that there couldn't be a successful philosophical argument to the effect that there are no objective normative truths? So there are some moral error theorists who will say that even though moral error theory is true and there are no moral facts, we should just continue believing that there are moral facts. So Jonas Olson says this kind of thing, right? So these are the moral conservationists. They'll say, well, yeah, there's no moral facts, and of course, when we're doing philosophy, we think about the arguments for and against moral facts and come to the conclusion that there are no moral facts. But when we leave the seminar room and just go back to ordinary life, we just start believing in moral facts again. So we just have false beliefs. I'm not sure why we couldn't take the same sort of view of this deliberation argument. I mean, maybe it's a bit tricky because I suppose assessing an argument is itself a kind of deliberation. So maybe we are just committed to if the argument is successful, we would be committed to objective, irreducible, normative truths just across the board. But yeah, I don't know. That's just one other way that you might respond to it.
Yeah.
Okay then. So I don't think this is as good as the companions in guilt argument.
Neither do I. So it's just a question of whether it's a D or an E.
See,
so what I'll say is this.
Okay.
It looks like, even from a rough sketch of it, I can sort of chart a course for a few possible replies that I think could be tractable. But what I'll say about this, and the reason I'm going to give this a low ranking, is because pending additional argumentation, I'm not even sold on the idea that these types of irreducibly normative facts are needed for deliberation in the first place. So I feel like I have a bunch of backup moves, but I'm just not convinced by the initial premise, that particular premise where these are needed for deliberation.
Sure.
What's the case for that? But the other thing I'll say in defense of the argument is, you just sketched out the argument. And of course, when someone sketches out an argument and they have a particular premise, they might say, look, that premise might look implausible on the face of it, but I'm going to do a bunch of work to show why you should actually accept that premise.
Yes.
And then that's a bunch of stuff outside of the context of the formalization. I haven't seen that. And so it makes it, so I'm going to give it the grade that I'm going to give it, but pending the possibility for it to move up the scale if I find out more.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to be clear. Look, it's been a little while since I've read Enoch's book. I may not have presented it in the fairest way. So, don't take my word for it, right? I am going to say that this argument gets a D, and the reason why I'm giving it a D is because I don't think it's as good as the companions in guilt argument, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's something. There's just there is a kind of creativity to it that I can appreciate, and I appreciate that it's it is sort of it's a novel argument. It doesn't seem to be all that similar to any other argument in the literature. And I suppose in a sort of similar way to the companions in guilt, maybe it could help move the conversation forward if if it turns out that there is some way of tying a. So okay, let me put it this way. It does seem reasonable to say that when we deliberate, we think about our reasons, right? If I just put it that way, that seems fair enough. I'm thinking about the reasons for and against my choice, and so you are going to have to give some account of what's going on there. What are those reasons? And so maybe in that sense, it perhaps can play some useful role in moving things forward. So personally, I that's why I'm going to put it in the D tier.
So I'm inclined to put it in the E tier,
Okay.
but I think that there's probably stuff that I'm more opposed to, and I don't know enough about this one, so I'll defer to you on this.
Okay, fair enough. Well then, in that case, it just goes straight in D tier, right? Okay. Next up, we have moral convergence, the moral convergence argument. Um, I don't know. I don't know if you want to explain any of these. I'm happy to explain them, or I did ask
I'm
to.
enjoying you
So
explaining them.
okay then. So the moral convergence argument, as I understand it, is going to be something like this. Um, when we look at the development of human societies over the past few hundred or thousand years, we find that there's been an increasing convergence in their moral views. So we find people increasingly converging towards sort of more liberal attitudes. I mean, we used to have societies where people would enslave each other and oppress other races and oppress women and so on. Gradually, what we found is a convergence towards the idea that all humans are worthy of equal consideration in some sense. So, we no longer enslave people. It's no longer considered acceptable to discriminate against other races or other sexes, etc. Um, and then the thought is, well, how do we explain this, right? What's the best explanation for this convergence of moral views? And the realist will say, well, the best explanation is um, people are reasoning about morality and they are over a long period of time, it's not easy, but over time they're able to reason their way to the correct moral beliefs. And so, we basically the picture that the realist has is human beings, we're obviously very flawed and limited. So, we start off with a whole bunch of appalling moral views, but over time we're able to reason our way to the correct views. And that accounts for why we've seen this convergence towards more liberal attitudes. Um, that's basically the argument.
All right. Should I start by commenting on this, or do you want to go?
I mean, you can go. I guess I just said
All
stuff.
right.
So yeah.
So I don't know how you're going to react to this, but this is the one I'm going to say is probably what I think is the best argument for moral realism.
Okay.
Now, part of the reason why I think that is because it's actually attempting to account for a tangible real world observation that I think is reasonably well established.
Yeah.
I agree that there has been convergence in people's moral attitudes, beliefs, and standards over time. Um, and, you know, so there's some nuance here, but because there's a difference between progress and convergence, and you don't want to conflate progress with convergence.
Right.
Sometimes
Yeah.
people do that. We'll say, well, there's been more progress, and there's something kind of question begging about that, because that's tying an evaluative claim into the very observation that's being offered. Whereas if you just focus on the fact that people are moving towards similar moral standards, you get around that. You're just dealing with a descriptive claim. So and I know that the better arguments focus on convergence.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing is that I tend to take a very holistic approach to evaluating arguments. I don't tend to like really simplified deductive arguments or focusing on a specific syllogism, and then treating formalized versions of arguments as being either total failures or totally knockdown arguments. Rather, I take each of them and I sort of weigh them up against all the other arguments and considerations for and against a particular position, and I try to chart out a sort of where I stake my territory philosophically in terms of weighing a broad range of considerations. And I'm naturally inclined towards a sort of abductive approach towards drawing conclusions. And this argument is an abductive argument. It
Right.
takes some observation and then says, what's the best explanation for this observation? And so it's employing a type of inference that I think is a one that's powerful, useful, and I have a natural affinity for. And it's doing it based on a tangible observation of real world phenomena that I actually think are true, and that I think it's pretty easy to establish are true. So, I think some people might argue actually there's been less convergence, yada, yada. I'm willing to grant that there just has been. So I'll grant it those things and then say that it's like on the right track for what I would take a good explanation or a good argument for moral realism to be. So I'll start by saying that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I suppose I mean, I probably disagree here because I'm not as I don't think that inference to the best explanation is particularly convincing, just in general, in terms of. So, I mean, to be clear, it's certainly very useful. I agree with that, but I don't, in general, believe in the things that are postulated as part of the best explanations for phenomena. And so, even if it were the case that moral, objective moral facts were the best explanation or part of the best explanation for moral convergence, I think I would still be pretty skeptical of objective moral facts. So, uh, yeah, I mean, for that reason, I'm probably going to end up putting it lower than you will. Um, and then I guess as well, I just think that anti-realists have got a whole bunch of ways of accounting for what's going on here, and actually I think that their explanations are, by most of the, let's say, the usual theoretical standards that we use to assess explanations. I suspect that there's going to be anti-realist explanations that are just better explanations by those standards. So the fact, for instance, that what we've seen over the last few hundred years is increasing globalization, increasing interaction between different cultures. It isn't particularly surprising when you consider that the values of those cultures might start to converge. That's actually what I think you would expect. In the same way that, like, if you have cultures that regularly interact, you'd probably expect that their fashions and food preferences would start to converge. Well, yeah, in the same way, their moral values are probably going to start to converge as well. Um,
Yeah,
so, yeah,
people use potatoes and fried chicken all over the world. There has been, I mean, this is another case where you could use the gastronomic parodies, and you could argue for gastronomic convergence as a type of argument for gastronomic realism.
right, yeah.
So
Um,
you could point out, look, I mean, what is it? It's probably most countries have a McDonald's in them. Is that evidence of gastronomic realism?
yeah, yeah, that's true. I remember I went to Istanbul quite recently. Well, it was last year, but um, I remember like being struck when I went there. I mean, it was great, but there were times when I would sort of look around and be like, this could just be, this could be anywhere. This could just be any city. It's, it's there are some places that sort of still have a kind of very like unique culture to them, where you sort of feel like you're in a different world. But there's a lot of parts of the city where it just feels like any other city. Um, and so there's been convergence, not just with respect to moral norms. There's been convergence in, with respect to so many different things, um, that I don't think that the moral convergence is so surprising.
Right. So, I'm certainly not going to accept moral realism on account of convergence. I just take it to have the form of argument that I think is a good approach to establishing that a particular account is correct.
Yes.
But I do take, I would have, if I had been asked what I think the better explanations are, I would point to, well, we have I mean, before we start appealing to and positing new properties and phenomena and facts to explain things, I would have thought we would first turn to the mundane facts about human sociology and psychology, and the forces of globalization are one of them. And the standard type of analogies and not analogies, like comparisons that I would appeal to would be fashion, music, food. And the food point, I think, is really critical, because there, prior to globalization, certain recipes and types of food were only accessible in certain parts of the world. So a lot of the fruits and vegetables that now have made their way all over Europe and Asia, those fruits and vegetables came from North and South America, Central America, potatoes and other sorts of things. And now they're everywhere in the world. Pizza, for instance, uses tomatoes, and you could probably get a pizza pretty much anywhere in the world. Is that evidence that it's objective, like pizzas are objectively good? I think that's ridiculous. We can explain this by appealing to similarities in human attitudes and desires. And as cultures, environments, and technology change, with globalization, you get greater homogeneity in the environmental conditions in which people are in. And insofar as cultural influences, psychological changes, greater environmental homogeneity, greater social interaction, all of those factors can account for why people would become more similar to one another along numerous dimensions. But you'll notice, there are differences. So different countries are going to have their own take on pizza and French fries, and fried chicken is one that I think of because I think of all these like different places where there's like different approaches to fried chicken. There's a place near here that does a Korean fried chicken. So there's like all the, I don't know where I'm going with this. I just like talking about food. But it's these particular types of food preparations have spread all over the world that weren't there 1,000 years ago. And are we tempted to say, oh, well, it must be because they're all reasoning towards recognizing what the correct food to eat is, what like the objectively good food to eat is? That just seems silly. Like, no, it's just people are similar to one another. And so when you provide recipes and opportunities to prepare those recipes, people will tend to converge on having the same sorts of recipes. I don't find anything mysterious about that. And I wouldn't posit extra facts to account for that. And I don't know why we would do that for morality.
Okay, so I suppose you've already said that this argument is, you find it probably the most convincing of the lot of them because of the form that it's taking, the approach that it's taking. So I would guess it sounds like you're inclined to put it in S tier. Where would I put this? I mean, because I need to make sure that I am going to put something in S tier.
Do I have to pick S tier? I think I'm putting this in A tier. I'm
Okay,
not putting
well,
this in S.
something has to go in S tier.
There will be something that goes in S tier,
Okay,
which maybe you'll object, but I'm putting this in A.
where would I put
What about you?
this? I can't bring myself to put this in A tier. This is a tricky one. I think the thing is that like, okay, so like I said, I have this general concern about the idea that inference to the best explanation is truth tracking, but I can very easily like I can easily see why people hold that it is, and I can kind of easily get on board with the like. So I can put myself in that perspective, and then if I do that, I can think, yeah, okay, this form of argument does, that is, I suppose, maybe better than some of these other arguments. Yeah, I'd probably be inclined to go with like B or C. So now we have to are we producing different lists, or have we got a compromise?
I've got
Because
my own list, but
okay,
if you have the canonical list,
right,
then we might
well,
need to compromise for that list,
okay,
or we
well, you
could
know
make
what?
separate
I'll
lists.
just compromise and I'll accept the A tier for this one. So there we go.
Fair enough.
Yeah, put moral convergence into A tier. Okay then. Right. Well, next up we have Well, I've said intuitionism slash phenomenal conservatism. There's actually like a whole bunch of different types of arguments that are all very, very similar, as we will see, because there's others on this list that are kind of similar. So basically, the idea of this sort of argument would be something like this. Basically, the phenomenal conservative will say, in general, so this is a general claim about how we form beliefs. In general, if it seems to you that P is the case, then in the absence of defeaters, that gives you reason for believing that P is the case. So right now, for instance, I look at my table and it seems to me that there is a cup in front of me. And so the phenomenal conservative will say, yeah, I mean, like, you have this visual appearance, there's a visual seeming that there's a cup in front of you, there's no particular reason to doubt it, so you're justified in believing that there's a cup in front of you. Or like, I can remember earlier today, I remember eating a carrot, and again, there's no particular reason to doubt that memory, so I'm justified in believing that I ate a carrot earlier today. So this is a very general claim about about all beliefs, right? Like, there's various different kinds of seemings. There's perceptual seemings, there's intellectual seemings, there's memorial seemings, and seemings justify beliefs. And among the seemings, there are moral seemings. So it seems to be the case that uh, torturing babies is wrong. And there's no particular reason to doubt that torturing babies is wrong. So you're justified in believing that torturing babies is wrong. That's that's basically the idea.
All right, this is our S tier.
This is you're putting this in S tier.
I think
Okay.
something's got to go there. I think this is going to be it.
Okay. Um, do you want to explain why?
Yeah,
Why
these
this
are
is
these
yeah.
kinds of arguments are really hard to respond to.
Mhm.
And I think that the kinds of like the intuitive appeals are the kinds of positions that realists take that are the most incorrigible and the sort of I think that they are the sort of last defense that realists would have if you dismantled all their other arguments. I think this is the one they're not going to give up.
Right, yeah. Um, I think that, with philosophical arguments in general, I always see them as kind of coming in like two classes. You get these very sophisticated technical arguments where you have like 11 premises and each premise has got like seven sub premises and they're really beautifully intricately structured. Um, but at the end of the day, I don't think those sorts of arguments ever really convince anybody, right? People adopt the
Right.
positions that they adopt on the basis of like there are some things that just kind of feel right, and I think for a lot of people it is just going to seem like realism is it's just sort of obviously like of course it's morally wrong to torture babies, and of course that's not just my opinion. Right, that's not just my opinion, like it's clearly a fact that it's morally wrong to torture babies. I think that is you know that kind of argument gets at something which like really is motivating realism, right? Like it's
Yeah,
expressing something that.
think about it this way. If there were no, if the deliberative indispensability argument had never been made, or moral convergence argument had never been made, or companions and guilt had never been made, do you think there'd still be moral realists? Because I do.
Yes, yeah.
Now, if you took away the intuitive or the appeals to intuition,
Right,
are
yeah.
people gonna are people gonna go around having little or no intuition in favor of realism? Then they'll hear companions and guilt or deliberative indispensability and go, ah, shit, okay, I guess I'm convinced realism is true. All right, well, I didn't want it to be true, but I guess it is. That's not how I see realism framed or presented by its proponents. Its proponents seem to me to be like, hell yeah, realism is true. It's intuitive. And then all of the arguments that come after that are window dressing. They're not essential. What's essential about it is the fact that its proponents find it intuitive.
um I think another point I would say in favor of this is it does try to relate the case for realism to a more general epistemology, which I mean does have some plausibility. I mean, um, the idea that, well, like ultimately, if you think about what your beliefs are based on, like in the end, it's just going to bottom out in something seems to be the case to you. I mean, I think there is like some plausibility to that. It's certainly, I mean, it's not like it's certainly not a crazy position, right? That yeah, I mean, so obviously, if you ask something like, well, why do you believe the Big Bang occurred? There's going to be a very sophisticated chain of inference getting you to that conclusion. But like ultimately, what is it going to be based on? Well, it's going to be based on, I've just looked at a graph or something, and then why do I believe that there are actually splotches on the graph in the way that I think there are? Well, it's just because that's how it visually seems to me. So I do sort of appreciate this. I can understand this idea that yeah, ultimately our beliefs are always going to bottom out in these seemings. That's the case for everything. So why wouldn't you similarly trust your moral seemings? Um, yeah.
Yeah, there's a few concerns I do have about this, though. Uh, the biggest concern is simply that I myself don't have these seemings. And so
Right.
this kind of argument, without someone bringing more to bear. Like if someone said, look, it's not, if let's say there's just two people and another person says, it seems to me that realism is true and they're an epistemic peer, and it doesn't seem that way to me. We're at an impasse if that's the only consideration that's on the table. Seems to you, doesn't seem that way to me. Okay, we're not going to get it. We're at a tie. Realists might then, though, say most people that have considered this are realists or have these seemings, or most people in general have these seemings. But then they're starting to make additional types of arguments that go beyond just a direct appeal to their own seemings. So if the realist, says to me, "Don't you have the seeming? Isn't that the strongest reason for you to endorse this?" If I did, then it might be, but I don't. And so what I'm left with is other people reporting that it seems true to them. And at best, even if we accepted phenomenal conservatism and granted that they are justified in being realists, at least insofar as it seems true to them, in the absence of defeaters, okay, but I'm also justified in not being a realist on the same grounds. So there's something that I find unsatisfactory about at least the phenomenal conservative element of this, which is that all it provides you is a type of private justification. It doesn't provide anything that amounts on its own to a substantive, publicly valuable argument. It's not like if we were detectives, if we were two detectives in a case and someone says, look, I got this strong hunch that, Alex down the street committed the murder. Maybe that is a reason. Let's grant that that's a reason for them to think Alex did it. They trust their hunches. Okay, if I don't have their hunch, I could rely on like an inductive inference. Maybe 80% of the time they've had hunches before, they've been correct. Now I do have evidence that it's Alex down the street. But if I don't know this person and I have no idea whether they're, and it seems to me like I actually have a contrary hunch that Alex didn't do it. They seemed innocent to me. I'm not going to take that too seriously. But if they point to the body and, it's carved into the corpse's chest, Alex did this, ha, ha, ha. And there's Alex's fingerprints on the knife. Okay, now we're talking. There's publicly valuable evidence for me. Part of my concern with these phenomenal conservatism appeals is they're at best all they are is private justification, so that doesn't get me anywhere. But the other problem is that I often see them, if phenomenal conservatism and direct appeals to one's own intuitions are where one stops, then it doesn't provide us with these publicly valuable arguments, and that is, I think, dialectically useless. You can only preach to the choir with these arguments. But I also think that these arguments, and this isn't a sort of intrinsic feature or like a logical entailment of them, but I think they tend to bleed over into other often implicit presumptions that go unstated. So those that make the phenomenal conservatism appeal in defense of moral realism often seem to presume that other people share their intuitions, including me, to the point some of them are so confident that if I tell them I don't have realist intuitions, they're incredulous. And I've even had people tell me that I'm lying or I'm pretending not to have the intuitions, or that I'm delusional and that I must have the intuitions. So there's a sort of there's I think a risk of appealing to one's own intuitions, of a profound overconfidence that those intuitions are in some sense shared or universal, either as a contingent feature of the way other people reason, or even as a sort of universal feature of the way any rational agent would reason. So someone might even think, look, any reasonable person is going to have the same intuitions I have, insofar as my intuitions are the output of like a rational process. And I think that both of those presumptions are mistaken.
Right, yeah. I mean, so, okay, this is why I would be... I really don't want to put this into S tier. And the reason why is because I just don't have those intuitions. So, it would be one thing to say, well, so if somebody said to me, Kane, do you have the intuition that torturing babies is wrong? I'd probably say yes to that, right? I'm very strongly against torturing babies. So fair enough, I have that intuition. But I don't think that really does anything in terms of getting you to moral realism, because that could just be a kind of emotional response, or it could like be based on what I take my values to be. What you need in order to get to moral realism would be the intuition that it is a stance independent fact that torturing babies is wrong. And I mean, I don't have that intuition. In fact, if anything, I think I have the opposite intuition. My intuition is that that's false. So it is a stance independent fact that torturing babies is wrong. My intuition is that's false. So in the absence of defeaters, I guess I'm justified in being a moral anti-realist, right? And so yeah, um, yeah, so I don't know. I feel like this argument actually, if anything, it kind of just backfires. It's like it feels like what if I was to accept the epistemology that you're putting forward, I now have more justification for being an anti-realist. Um, so I don't know. It doesn't seem like this is a very good argument for moral realism. So yeah,
Is this being distinguished from other intuitions? So you have phenomenal conservatism. Is this being distinguished from the Moorean shift and the other ones?
oh yeah, I've got Moorean shift as a separate argument.
Okay, and is this
Yeah.
one specifically phenomenal conservatism?
You know what? Maybe we should just say. I mean, I put like intuitionism slash phenomenal conservatism, but let's just say phenomenal conservatism just to make it, yeah,
Okay,
just to make it
so
easier.
if we're considering phenomenal conservatism just on its own, I'm tempted to respond in a similar way and say that in and of itself is, I want to say something like rhetorically or dialectically or argumentatively inert. It does nothing for me. It doesn't move me towards realism at all because I don't have the intuition. And as you say, if what we're being offered is, hey, you can get to moral realism if you employ this particular epistemic framework, and you go, okay, great. What is the epistemic framework? Oh, well, you're justified in believing what seems to be true in the absence of defeaters. Oh, well, it seems to me that anti-realism is true and realism is false. So thank you. Thanks. And now I have you've just added, another weapon into my own toolkit insofar as I grant that this is a tool to be used. So I'll grant that point specifically for phenomenal conservatism, which means this gets a lower score.
Okay then.
Do we give
So
it an E then? Because it's actually anti-persuasive?
I do I want to put this in E? I mean, let me because E is like the absolute worst. And you know what? I'm not gonna put it in E just because, as I said, I think that right. So here's the thing. Yes, it is anti-persuasive for me, but I can totally see how it would be persuasive for others. Right? Other people do have these intuitions, and as I said, I can understand the plausibility of the phenomenal conservative epistemology in general. So I don't know. I'd be inclined to put it in like C tier, maybe.
I'm okay with
Yeah.
C. Let's go with that.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
So
Well.
far, we haven't had any. So I think this could have gone in the direction of this being like I'm with S and you're with C. But I was thinking more broadly of the entire apparatus around which sort of appeals to intuition function.
Yeah.
And a lot of things follow from that, which we'll get to.
Yeah. Okay. So next up on the list is the Moorean shift. The Moorean shift. So Moorean shift works like this. Let's say that somebody presents an argument against moral realism, so an argument to the effect that there are no objective moral facts. The Moorean will say, well, the claim that there are objective moral facts, the claim that it is objectively wrong to torture babies for fun, that claim is more plausible than any philosophical premise you could use in an argument to the contrary. So, I mean, look, yeah, there's, it may be like the evolutionary debunking argument or something, right? Like, so the evolution, maybe somebody presents an evolutionary debunking argument and they say, well, like, if these claims about human evolutionary history are true, then our moral intuitions are not truth tracking. Well, okay, but how plausible is that premise compared to it is objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? I mean, surely nothing could be more plausible than it is objectively wrong to torture babies for fun. So, so if there's any argument for anti-realism, then we know that denying the conclusion is going to be more plausible than accepting all of the premises, right? We should deny the conclusion, and so that's going to tell us that one of those premises is wrong, rather than accept the premises and take ourselves to the conclusion. That's the Moorean shift.
Yeah, this is just, to me, my initial reaction is just question begging presumptuous. Done.
Okay. You don't find this at all persuasive?
Yeah, of course not, because what I would want them to show me is why. the whatever the appeal to realism is more persuasive than the arguments to the contrary. And
Yeah.
that itself would need to be an argument for why it's more persuasive than an argument to the contrary. So they would just need to give me some other argument for realism. I mean, this has some affinities, to what I think this only works insofar as one is inclined to have the relevant kind of intuition. And so, I mean, maybe it's got to go in a similar category to phenomenal conservatism,
Okay, but
but
so
I don't
let's.
know.
Well, what? So okay, maybe what if the Moorean says this? Like, well, look, I mean, surely though. So this kind of procedure that I'm suggesting is, like clearly this is the sort of, in general, the way that we approach assessing any sort of argument, right? So there's a bunch of premises which have the conclusion that uh, you know there are no objective moral facts, and I can then offer this alternative argument which says, well, there are objective moral facts, so one of those premises is wrong. So what we're left with then, so we have argument number one, premises which have the conclusion that there are no objective moral facts. Argument number two, there are objective moral facts, so one of those premises must be wrong. Well, now we're just left with a plausibility comparison, right? So we have the claim that there are objective moral facts. We have this set of premises. Which of these is more plausible? And clearly, torturing babies for fun, well, clearly that's wrong. So that's probably going to come out as being more plausible than these weird philosophical premises. Oh, oh dear. It looks like, oh no. Technical problems. Okay. Um, okay, then I will pause. Okay, so there was a slight technical issue, but yeah, so the Moorean says this. They say, well, basically, there's two arguments that we're being asked to assess, right? Argument number one has a set of premises to the conclusion that there are no objective moral facts. Argument number two says there are objective moral facts, so one of those premises must be wrong. And surely, I mean, the claim that it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun, well, that's always going to be more plausible than these, technical philosophical premises. Do you not see any value in this way of, of proceeding?
I don't have a problem with someone having that as the general schema of saying, hey, if your conclusion is something that I think is ridiculous and it's not obvious to me what the problem with the premises are, I'm still going to assume there's got to be a problem in the premises somewhere.
Yep.
So if someone has this argument and it's really, let's say it's got 73 premises in it, and then the conclusion is all humans are carrots or something like that. I'm not going to accept that argument. Humans are not carrots. And I would be extremely confident that there would be at least one problem, one serious problem somewhere in the premises of that argument. So I don't have a problem with that as a general approach. It's just that I don't have some inclination to think that moral realism is especially plausible in the first place. Yeah. And so why would I go around with this heuristic that any argument against realism is going to be less plausible than realism? Why should I think that? And you would need to, I don't have that inclination in the first place. So it's not like if someone said, if you're going to make this Moorean comparison to like hands, well, it does seem to me that I have hands. If someone presents an argument that I don't have hands, I probably wouldn't even make a shift in that case because I don't have problems. I don't have personally a big problem with skeptical views. So someone, if you wanted to make some argument for like scientific anti-realism and then argue that like technically speaking, I don't have hands. I might be like, all right, well, I'm actually okay with that. I don't know if that's something you'd argue for, but I don't have that kind of inclination in the first place for these sorts of these sort of brute appeals. I could see myself having that sort of, in other words, I would say this. I don't have a problem with the procedure of saying, hey, if the conclusion is too ridiculous, there's probably a problem in the premises and you're coming to reject the premises. Fine. But I don't have a general opposition to skeptical positions. I don't think moral anti-realism is a notably skeptical position. And I don't share the initial inclination that realism is super plausible. So in this particular case, I don't feel the force of this at all. I don't know what it's doing.
Right. Yeah. Pretty. I mean, exactly the same for me. I don't think the Moorean argument works, even in response to radical skepticism. So I certainly don't feel the force of it when it comes to moral skepticism in particular. Um, but okay, look. I mean, you have just so we've kind of granted that. Well, maybe there is some uh, there's something reasonable about this general method of assessment, right? Like, if somebody presents 73 premises to the effect that you don't have hands, yeah, maybe it's fine to say, well, I do have hands, there's probably something wrong with your argument. So I would put this very low. I don't know if I would put it in E tier, but
Let's give it a D.
D, yeah. The Moorean shift
I
in
think I
view.
know what I want to put in E already, and we'll see if we end up agreeing. I think we will agree. So
Okay.
I think there's some places where we've compromised, but I think we're going to agree on E. I'm curious to see if we get to it.
Okay then. So the this argument I'm calling the face value of moral practice, and I don't know if this is really like a single argument or if it's just going to be like a whole set of arguments. But there's a way of that so there's a way of like trying to argue for moral realism where we appeal to just maybe that actually this isn't so much an argument for moral realism. I see this used more commonly as a kind of burden shifting move, where the idea is supposed to be, well, if you just look at moral discourse and moral argument, then uh, either it like just kind of contains realist presuppositions, or maybe realism is like the best explanation for what's going on there. I mean, so for example, if you take the phenomenon of moral disagreement, well, when people have a moral disagreement, it doesn't seem to be like other types of disagreement. So I might dislike vanilla ice cream, and you like vanilla ice cream. And when we have that sort of disagreement in taste, we're fine just saying, okay, whatever. People have different tastes, right? You like vanilla, I dislike vanilla. Fine. But if you think about a moral disagreement, well, that's not quite the same. If I think that abortion is permissible and you think abortion is wrong, well, we're going to have probably going to have an argument about it, and I'm going to say things like, it's a fact that abortion is wrong, or it's true that abortion is wrong. I'm going to assert the proposition that abortion is wrong, or rather permissible. That was the way I set up the example. But it doesn't matter. So we all see the point, right? The point is, it seems like when people engage in moral disagreements, they are presupposing realism, and then maybe that means that realism is the sort of default view, at least. I don't know. Is that a fair summary of this sort of argument?
Yeah, I think, so there's appeals to moral disagreement.
Mm.
There are, of course, there's also appeals to moral disagreement as arguments for anti-realism. So
Right.
there's some kind of balancing out there, possibly. Although I do think it's silly to just think, well, if there's an argument for X and against X, they must be equivalent in evidence or weight. That's
Yeah.
goofy. But there's this category, I think, would include disagreement. But is this also incorporating, and I'm presuming it does, general semantic considerations?
Yeah. I mean,
So the fact that structurally murder is wrong has
yeah,
a propositional structure that seems, at least on the surface, to weigh against expressivist, non-cognitivist accounts that don't accord it some sort of propositional status.
right.
So there's that. Then there's other sorts of face value claims where it seems like the claims, and not just in a disagreement context, but someone might say in an assertoric context or deliberative context. That they seem to be, moral claims seem to be used to state facts. They seem to be used to deliberate about what to do and to reason. They seem to figure into arguments. And so they
Yeah.
seem both to have the superficial structure and the superficial function of the sorts of claims about which people appear to be employing them as though they're at the least propositional. And so we could rule out the non-cognitivist stuff. And also, some might argue, seemingly realist in character, like the types of propositions seem to be describing these stance independent facts. So that would be another element of it, would
Yeah,
it
yeah,
not?
yeah. And I think if we another thing to think about is like if you engage in a moral dispute with somebody, um, like you might change the other person's mind, or they might change your mind, and the way that those disputes usually go is quite similar to factual disputes. So if it's so if you like vanilla ice cream and I don't like vanilla ice cream, like I'm not going to change your mind about that. I'm not going to like change your tastes. I mean, maybe I could, but probably not, right? We're probably not going to just have a conversation and then you end up changing your tastes and disliking vanilla ice cream. Whereas, we might well have a conversation about abortion, and maybe, I start out thinking that abortion is wrong, and you convince me that abortion is permissible. Um, so, yeah, there's a whole bunch of like different things which all seem to, the argument would go, they all seem to sort of have the face value, at least, of being realistic or having realistic presuppositions.
Right. I think there's more that could be said for these arguments too. And so one of the ways in which I see this framed when it's actually deployed in a way that is rather efficient is in the analysis of claims given particular types of views. And so the person that I've seen do this, I think the most effectively as a representation of this approach is Mike Humer. And Mike Humer uses this kind of process of elimination approach. So Humer will do this. Humer will say, okay, you've got these five metaethical positions on offer. You've got naturalist and non-naturalist moral realism, and then you've got non-cognitivism, error theory, and relativism. And we could do a semantic analysis of what these claims are under these different sorts of views. So if you're a relativist, it would look like you would have to say, if it's the case that someone thinks that it's okay to torture babies, then if that person says it's okay to torture babies, then the sentence, it's okay for that person to torture babies, is true. Or if that person says it's okay for me to torture babies, it's true. It actually is good or morally permissible for them to torture babies. And then I think Humer would then say, well, that's absurd. It's absurd to think that if a person thinks it's okay to torture babies, then it is for that person to do so. So relativism is absurd. And if you say, well, why is it absurd? At least one of the reasons is that's not how people talk. That's not how they use moral language. No one goes around, if a person encounters a thief in the alleyway and the thief's like, give me your wallet. And you say no. And they go, and then they say, but I think it's morally permissible for me to take your wallet. It would be strange for someone to go, oh, well, I didn't know that you thought it was permissible. In that case, then it is permissible, and I don't really have any objection. Here you go. So relativism is absurd. Now, I'm not granting that this is actually a good objection to relativism, but that's the way that that might be analyzed. And then error theory would say something like torturing babies for fun is not wrong. That it would say that that statement's true. That's absurd. Of course, it's wrong. So error theory is out. And then non-cognitivism, that's going to have all these semantic problems when you try to embed it in arguments. It's like
Right.
try to put murder boo into an argument. It doesn't make sense. It can't even function as a premise. So non-cognitivism is out. And so by process of elimination, we've ruled out error theory, relativism, and non-cognitivism. Realism wins by default.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I've seen Humer make that kind of move. And so that's a way that you could use it as not just a burden shifting move, but a straightforward process
Yeah.
of elimination where you just say, look, the I guess error theory is not going to have the semantic problems. It's going to have it's going to be just counterintuitive, I think. But
Yeah.
it's counterintuitive in that case, at least in virtue
I
of
mean,
how we would analyze the sentence that would commit you to saying is true. So
well,
there's a semantic element to this.
I think error theory is probably still going to be in conflict with what they take the face value of moral practice to be, though, because I mean, you can just so if you just take moral practice at face value, well, we sort of assert various moral claims and we deny others, but our moral discourse certainly isn't analogous to witchcraft discourse or phlogiston discourse, where we just don't think that these things exist. So again, like taken at face value, it looks like, okay, well, if I'm saying things like abortion is wrong and giving to charity is not wrong,
Right.
and I'm distinguishing these two things, then maybe there's some like presupposition that, or at least it seems at face value like that's in conflict with the idea that just all moral claims are false.
Right. Yeah. It would be weird if people were using discourse in a way that did determinately fit with a realist analysis, but they weren't in any way committed to or intending to mean it that way and they were actually anti-realists. That would be very strange. It would require, like, what, like everybody's a fictionalist or something. It'd be really, really
Yeah.
strange. So it's not going to have that feature. And so, yeah, you could try this process of elimination. You could try burden shifting, and there's a variety of ways, I guess, you could leverage these types of considerations. And I think overall, what they amount to is saying, look, the way that people speak and appear to think about morality sure as hell looks like it's supporting realism.
Yeah. So, okay. What do we think about this argument? I think I'm probably I would be more sympathetic to this than the Moorean shift. So since that I've put the Moorean shift in D tier, I'd probably put this higher than that. I think that one of the problems I have with this is that the claim about what the face value of moral practice is doesn't seem to me to be very well supported. So, I mean, this is something that you've talked about a lot. So, I mean, you probably have more to say about this than I do. But it seems like when philosophers make claims about the supposed face value of moral practice, what they're actually talking about is the face value of kind of like moral sentences that are just completely stripped of any context. So we're saying, like, well, you can consider a claim like murder is wrong, and then you can consider we will embed that claim in arguments like, if murder is wrong, then paying someone to murder is wrong. Murder is wrong, therefore paying someone to murder is wrong. And I mean, it's not really clear that, like, actually when people engage in moral discourse, that they are asserting these sorts of claims. I think that there's a danger of conflating the face value of the moral practice of philosophers, which maybe does sort of fit with this kind of analysis, with the face value of just moral practice in general, right? And I mean, I'm not sure whether that would, like, so when we appeal to the face value of moral practice, does it make a difference if we are appealing to the face value of philosophers who work in normative ethics versus just ordinary people? Because I could see an argument that, well, the people working in normative ethics are like they're the most plausible candidates for being moral experts. So when we appeal to the face value of moral practice, it's really the face value of, like, professional normative ethics that we should be looking at. Does that make sense? Like,
It does, although that would shade this into arguments from expertise or something like that.
yeah, that's a good point.
And I take face value arguments typically to be predicated on the supposed semantic content of ordinary moral language.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's how I usually understand them. So maybe we should just stick with that version then. I think if we're making a claim about ordinary moral language, then one issue with this type of argument is that it just isn't. It's not obvious, really, that it's not obvious to me that philosophers have any of the relevant evidence about what ordinary moral discourse actually looks like. So that might be an issue.
Right. So what I should say is that if I were to apportion the amount of work that I've actually done on these different arguments, you'll note that I'm not even especially familiar with deliberative indispensability. This is the particular argument that I've done almost all of my work on. It's effectively sort of in certain ways tangentially, but still very close to what my entire dissertation is on. So my dissertation is on the psychology of metaethics. You could say the psychology of folk metaethics. And what that's addressing is the question of, with respect to the question of realism and anti-realism, what do ordinary people think and how do ordinary people speak? That is what my dissertation is about. And what I end up arguing there is that the particular categories and distinctions in play in contemporary analytic metaethics, this distinction between moral realism and anti-realism, is a highly technical, metaphysically loaded or conceptually loaded distinction. I mean, I say conceptual, as a reference to Scanlon and Parfit, who might want to have a sort of they might want to deflate some of the ontological commitments of realism. Mm-hmm. I don't find that particularly compelling, but I don't find realism compelling, and I at least am sympathetic to what they're trying to do. In any case, uh, in any case, so there's this realist project of trying to account for ordinary discourse, and what I try to do in the dissertation is argue that a lot of the categories and presumptions that philosophers have constructed and the views that have emerged as a contrast to them, the anti-realist positions, are constructions within the analytic philosophical tradition that are not reflected in the way that ordinary people think. Michael Gill has a paper on this called Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics. I don't remember the exact title, but it's something like that, where Gill makes a comparison to mathematical Platonism. And you could imagine, two people talking about like they're adding up the money to pay for a bill or something, or write up a tip or something. It would be ridiculous to go, okay, well, the person added 3 plus 4 and they got 7, so that person's committed to mathematical Platonism. But it's equally absurd to say that they're committed to anti-Platonism, as if they reject Platonism every time they say 3 and 4 is 7. They're not taking a stance on this. It's just not a feature of ordinary mathematical discourse to take a position on the metaphysical status of like numbers. My preferred comparison, that's Gill's comparison, and I like it. I think it's a good one. Mine is to take it a bit outside of philosophy, although arguably there's philosophical elements of this, and compare this to quantum mechanics and say that ordinary people, when they make causal claims, I think it would be absurd to say that they're committed to like the Copenhagen or the many worlds or the, like the Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics whenever they say, like, I think it's going to rain tomorrow. And I think that the same applies in the case of metaethics. I don't think that a commitment to these weird philosophical positions is a feature of ordinary moral discourse. And so I take an extreme view, as far as I've never heard of anybody else defending this, but I argue for a kind of near global metaethical indeterminacy, where I argue that virtually no non-philosophers actually have, or I don't think they speak, think, or act in ways consistent with any particular metaethical position. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't know of anybody endorsing that, but I try to make a case for that. At the very least, what I can say is that so if you take a step back from that, there's this important problem that I have with the discourse, which is this area of work, descriptive metaethics. What is the content of ordinary moral thought and language? There's something puzzling about this. And I spoke with Don Loeb about this recently, which is this an empirical question or not? Because if this is not an empirical question, I'm not sure what kind of question it's supposed to be. Like, we're trying to figure out the meaning of ordinary moral claims, but we're not concerned with what people are trying to do when they actually use moral claims. What? So there's something there. But if it is an empirical question, okay, so if the former, then I think it's going to rely on a conception of language and meaning that I'm probably going to reject, and then I'm going to reject like pretty aggressively. Like, I think that there's just something very strange about these anti-empirical approaches. But if it is making an empirical claim, the empirical evidence just is not there to sustain any sort of claim that ordinary people speak or think in a way consistently like moral realists. It's just, that's not what the evidence suggests. So if it's not an empirical claim, I don't know what kind of claim it is. If it isn't, and I think it's going to have serious problems. If it is an empirical claim, the evidence doesn't support it. So on the other hand, that's not an easy case to make. So does that count in favor of it, that it's tough to refute it?
Right.
No. So I guess I've said a lot there, but basically, I'll just say briefly what the empirical evidence suggests. So there is empirical research on how people use these claims. What you get is a absolute mess. It's not clear whether participants are interpreting questions in the way researchers intend. And this is part of the reason I appeal to, I think the best explanation for this is that they don't have the conceptual distinctions to respond meaningfully to the questions in the way that the researchers want. And I think that the interpretations that they have are completely reasonable, but they just don't fit with the philosophical categories. That's my take on most of the literature. What I will say, though, and this is something I'm fond of pointing out.
Just clarify, when you say you said they don't respond to the questions in the way the researchers want, what would be an example of one of these questions?
Oh, sure. Okay, so let's say a researcher asks a participant whether they think, they say, hey, do you think whether murder is right or wrong, there's an objectively true answer to that question? And a person says, yes, I do. Does that mean the person's a realist? Right. Well, if you're operationalizing it as a measure of realism, then that person would have to interpret murder is wrong is objectively true to mean it's a stance-independent moral fact that murder is wrong. But when you actually ask people, hey, if we were to say murder is objectively wrong, what does it mean to say it's objective? My own research on this, I did ask people questions like this, and they will not typically say anything. Of course, they don't have the technical language most of the time, and if they do, it's questionable whether they even count as a non-philosopher, because at the very least, if they can respond to the question in a way that is philosophically informed, are they a non-philosopher? They might not have a degree in philosophy, but they have training in philosophy. So, it's now. I mean, this is already. I address this, but there's a continuum between someone being more of a philosopher and less of a philosopher. It's not like I have magical philosopher particles in me or something that they don't have. So, even if we rule out people that do have technical knowledge, they're not going to have the technical language, but they could at least say something like, yeah, it means that whether it's right or wrong we don't make it true, or it doesn't depend on us, or it's not true based on our culture, or it's not a matter of preference. There's a lot of ways that are pretty straightforward and like ordinary language-ish to convey that idea, that they don't need the technical language. But that's not typically what people say. They say a whole bunch of other stuff. A lot of times people understand objectivity to mean that there is some sort of clear and distinct answer. So it's a kind of epistemic interpretation. Sometimes they interpret it to mean that the judgment is made in an unbiased way. That is a reasonable interpretation of objective, but it's not the intended one. And so those are just a couple examples. There are other ways of measuring people's beliefs about moral realism and anti-realism, and they run into similar sorts of problems. People routinely interpret the questions that are intended to measure their views about metaethics as epistemic questions or normative questions about what their normative moral position is, or some sort of other, like a very common one when you give people questions about moral disagreements. You say, hey, two people disagree about a moral issue. Can they both be correct? And if they say yes, that's supposed to be relativism. But if you ask people why they could both be correct, they might say things, and they often do, as a matter of fact, say things like, well, they're thinking of different moral situations, one in which the action would be justified and one in which it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. So if you say two people disagree about whether stealing is wrong, can they both be correct? And a person says yes. And you say, well, why do you think they could both be correct? Someone might say, well, one person thinks it's okay to steal medicine, which it is, like to save your family, and the other thinks it's okay to steal just for fun or greed, and that's not okay. And they could both be right about that. Okay, but that's not relativism. That's just two different moral issues in the same broader category. So these are the kinds of responses you get for these sorts of questions. And what these are reasonable interpretations of the question. It's not obvious to people when you ask a question about moral disagreement that you're asking them to consider a disagreement about exactly the same moral issue in exactly the same context in exactly the same way. They're not trained as philosophers to recognize the context of the question you're asking in order to appreciate that that's what you're going for. So this is a problem with the research.
Okay. So it seems like where does that leave us then? So it seems like the sort of positive claim about what the face value of moral practice actually looks like is maybe not that well supported. On the other hand, we also don't really have much support for an alternative claim, right? We just sort of don't really know at the moment. That's kind of where we are.
But I want to make two other points on that. One of them is that what I take to be the best design study is a study by Pulsar and Wright. It's called Anti-Realist Pluralism. Mm-hmm. And what they did in that study, so Pulsar and Wright have been at the forefront of identifying the methodological problems I'm referencing. So I've done work on this. Pulsar and Wright have done work on this. And we've all worked to point out and identify these methodological problems. But they've done a lot of the work to try to preserve this method of giving people moral disagreements and then seeing how they evaluate them to see whether they're realist or anti-realist. They've done pretty much all of the work to try to, James Beebe has done some work too with forced choice problems. So other people have done work on this too. So I take that back. So other people have worked on this as well. But they did this study, came out in 2020, where they sort of systematically attempt to mitigate or eliminate as many of the methodological problems that they've identified or that other people have identified as possible. And then on top of that, to try to train the participants to understand the relevant conceptual distinctions so that they could respond meaningfully. And then on top of that, the response options that they give them for the questions, they're a lot more carefully worded to avoid ambiguities and conflations and misunderstandings. And so they attempt to do their very best to make sure that the participants interpret what they're asking the way they're intending to. And they probably have some degree of success with that. That creates a different problem. But when they did that, when they ran these studies, they had about 75% of the participants across, I think, 7 different paradigms. There's quite a few different ways they measure. So they use like 7 different measures, I think. or we could just say a bunch of them, nearly 10. And they had about 3/4 of the participants give consistently anti-realist responses.
Right.
So the best design study gets mostly anti-realist. Do I think that means most people in the world are anti-realists? No, because I don't know whether the participants were caused to be anti-realists by being trained in the purpose of the study, like in the context of the study, which I call spontaneous theorizing.
Yeah.
Could be, in other words, they weren't real anti-realists. You brought them in the study, you explained a bunch of stuff to them that they never thought about. They thought about it, and then they became anti-realists. So they're in a certain sense novice philosophers, and that no longer has the external validity. You can't, in other words, extrapolate from what they thought after training to what people think outside of the context of the study. For the same reason, if I put you through a crash course in quantum mechanics, you come to adopt the many worlds interpretation, and then like 90% of my students do that, I can't then say 90% of the world's population are many worlds proponents. That's right. Ridiculous. They didn't have training in quantum mechanics. So you have that problem. The other problem with that is that there's demographic issues. I don't want to get into too much detail, but I'll just say the participants were drawn from college students in the US. College students are disproportionately likely to be anti-realist, according to other studies, Beebe and Sakris. Moral relativism across the lifespan, I think, is the paper. And then there's also research on the demographic characteristics of people that do online surveys through Amazon's Mechanical Turk in the United States. And they're way more likely than the general public in the US to be atheists and agnostics, and atheists and agnostics are more likely to be anti-realist. And so they drew on two populations that were disproportionately likely to give high rates of anti-realist responses. And so the study has low generalizability to the rest of the world's population. So that's all I'll say on that. The best available study had very high anti-realist rates, but low generalizability. So again, I guess that gets us back where we started. We don't really know. But the last point I wanted to make is not about all the research. So I'm done with that because I'm saying too much about it, because that's what I do. I love that stuff so much. The last thing I'll say is I just reject at the outset that morality has that much of this surface appearance of being realist in the first place. So you point to disagreements. Okay, but you might say, well, people disagree and they make all these arguments and it looks realist. People disagree, or people argue. And I bet if you did a corpus analysis and you looked online, like on social media, people argue about whether movies are good, whether food is good, whether books are good, whether all kinds of things are good, about which I suspect they are very much not realist about those things.
Well, sounds like you've got a good argument for the face value of aesthetic realism there.
But that's not the move I would make. What I would make, I would point out, a couple things, which is that people argue for fun. Yeah. They're not always trying to demonstrate what's true. And the other thing is, a lot of arguments center on coordination problems, not so much on determining what's true. So if you and I are negotiating, like I'm trying to buy something from you and you're trying to sell something, I want the lowest price, you want the highest price. There's not a fact of the matter about the correct price. We just have competing interests. And if we're arguing about the price, we don't have to think, nor would I think it make much sense to suppose that there is a fact of the matter about the correct price. It's just a question of what we'll both agree to. And so arguments often occur in contexts about which it would be ridiculous to think there's a fact of the matter. It's just a clash of it's a coordination problem of values.
So this is an important distinction between the case of like moral arguments on the one hand, and then say a disagreement in taste with respect to vanilla ice cream, right? So I mentioned, you like vanilla ice cream, I don't like vanilla ice cream. We're not going to argue about it, but probably the reason why we wouldn't argue about it is just that it sort of doesn't matter, right? It doesn't make any difference if you want to eat vanilla ice cream and I don't. Well, okay, who cares? Whereas, if I want to live in a world where abortion is accessible and you want to live in a world where like there's no killing of fetuses, now there's a conflict. Like now we kind of have to have a discussion just in order to come to some sort of compromise, in order to decide, well, what are we actually going to do? All right, is this going to be something that we allow or not? So it certainly, and yeah, like you say, I mean, people actually do argue about all sorts of things that they're not realist. I'm certainly not an aesthetic realist, but I'm happy to argue about movies, music, right? And I might well convince another person to that there's something worthwhile in some movie, or they might convince me. I have changed my mind about some of these things as a result of discussions with other people. So yeah, I don't find this argument very convincing either. It's,
Yeah, I mean, and then one final point that I guess is more in line with sort of less unconventional stuff than like my weird metaethical indeterminacy is if you're a constructivist or a cultural relativist, you can disagree with other people too.
yeah.
You could disagree about what the constructivist procedure you both agree to, what the output of it is. So two people that are both saying, "Hey, we want to employ the principles that we would agree to behind a veil of ignorance." You could disagree on what people would agree to behind a veil of ignorance. That doesn't mean you think there's an objective fact of the matter that's independent of people's stances. It's just that you disagree on what the collective of people's stances would result in. So that
Yeah, yeah.
constructivist, same with cultural relativists. So two people, one person could say, this action is consistent with the standards of our culture, and someone could say, no, it's not. You're living in the past. Society has moved on. Society's changed, and actually, most people are against it now, so it's not okay. And you think it is. I don't know if I said it was okay or not
Yeah.
okay, but the reverse of whatever the other person said. And so, two people that are both, they could both be indexing their claims to the same framework. They're not moral realists, and yet they disagree. So, just pointing to this surface structure is not a good way to show
Right.
that people are realists.
I mean, and the same will actually be true with respect to first order moral claims, because you could have two people who are just utilitarians. They just sort of have let's say they're non-cognitivists. They just approve of maximizing happiness. Obviously, you can disagree about what's going to maximize happiness. Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of it could get offloaded onto the non-moral facts. So
Um, okay then. So yeah, where is this one going to go? I
this is
think
the hardest one to rate.
okay. I think that this should go above D tier because I think it's better than the Moorean shift. Um, so now
Wait, where did the Moorean shift go? I didn't
Moorean
write that
shift
one
was
down.
in D. Um, so and then we have companions in guilt and phenomenal conservatism in
Is it
C.
better than those?
Um, hmm. I would be inclined. I'm inclined to say no. I don't think it is. Um, I'm actually
So we have one option, which is to put it also in C, and we still have, I
yeah.
think B is still empty, or we might have to bump those up to a B and
I'm
then move
I'm
it into
I'm
the C
inclined
spot.
to bump phenomenal conservatism up to a B. I,
Okay, and then
I'm
what about companions and guilt?
I'm happy with that to remain in C. Um, but
So you
then
think phenomenal conservatism is better than companions and guilt?
oh, this is so difficult though because phenomenal conservatism, as I said, it backfires, right? Because
Right.
if I apply phenomenal conservatism, I just end up with more justification for anti-realism. Ah, damn, this is tricky. Am I going to have to bump companions and guilt up? Oh, I don't really want to put companions and guilt in B. I might have to
You could
though.
just have three things in the C
We
category. That
could just
doesn't
have
have
three
to be a
things.
B.
You know what? You're right. So okay, are you all right putting face value argument in C?
Yeah, it does. It's a good middle zone for me. What I'll say about it is, I think I present really good arguments against it, but those arguments require a ridiculous amount of work, and I don't think it's unreasonable to think that if a whole lot of work has to go into showing why something's wrong, there's a reasonable chance that from an outside view, something has gone wrong in my arguments.
Yes, but there's a couple of steps here though because even if we were to accept the claim about the face value that so there's people disagree so let's say that yeah people are
Oh,
perceiving
right.
these
I
as
forgot
truths
all
about
about
facts
this.
then I mean there's this whole other question of well yeah but maybe as we already said maybe they're disagreeing because they're just both utilitarians or whatever like you could account for it in that way
But there's a
and
deeper
and
problem,
then
which I thought you were going to say this, and
yeah
maybe you will.
I, I mean
The problem is that even if we grant that the face value, how good of a reason is that to think that
right,
realism is true?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think it's a particularly good reason. It might seem at face like, look, a lot of people believe in God. A lot of people have superstitious beliefs. There's all sorts of good reasons to think that human cognition may be structured in ways where we're sensitive to patterns that aren't really there. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in general human capacity for reasoning well.
Yes.
So
So this is yeah, that's like the big thing is that well, I mean, you could go back to the 1600s and the face value practice of witchcraft discourse was realist, right? But I don't know, was that a good reason back then to believe in witches? doesn't seem like it would have been. So yeah, I mean it's I think it's a pretty weak argument. I still think though I do think it's better than the Moorean shift because at least there's some, with the Moorean shift, it's just like saying, well, this is more plausible. All right, why? Well, at least there's some explanation for
Yeah.
why.
This
Yeah,
has an explanation. This has got to be better than Moorean shift. But then the only question is where it stands in relation to companions in guilt and phenomenal conservatism.
um, yeah. I mean, I'm happy to just sort of put it. I I, I feel like if I'm being honest, I should probably say that companions in guilt is better. I think it's probably a better argument.
So do you
Um,
want to? So we could bump companions in guilt up to B, and then keep phenomenal conservatism and face value in C.
yeah, I guess it's going to have to be that way, isn't it? All right.
I'm going to do it. That's what I'm doing.
Okay. I'll do it. Yeah. So okay then. Well, um, we got three left. So the next one is the expertise argument, which is, well, basically the idea here is relatively simple. In general, you should defer to expert consensus, right? So if most of the experts, if most of the people who have expertise on a given issue believe that P, then you should that gives you some good reason also to believe that P, because these are people who have thought about the issue very carefully. They have a great deal of knowledge about it. They're able to assess the arguments and the evidence, etc. So in general, you should trust experts. Now, when it comes to moral realism, the relevant experts are going to be people who are trained in metaethics, so professional philosophers who specialize in metaethics, and there is a moderate consensus, not anything close to a universal consensus, but there is, like most professional philosophers do lean towards moral realism. I think among metaethicists, it's something like 69%. I
I
might
can
be
I
wrong
can
on that.
give the numbers if you
Okay,
want.
yeah. Well, let's hear the numbers then.
Yeah. So the source first is the 2020 Phil Paper survey. It was a survey sent out to a bunch of philosophers, mostly those working within the analytic tradition. There's probably a few other characteristics of who they sent the surveys to. It was like what 1,785 respondents, something like that. I think most of them answered the question about realism or anti-realism. This is across all specializations.
Hmm.
The percentage that leaned towards or accepted moral realism was 62% for the
Okay.
2020 Phil Paper survey. If you focus just on those that specialize in metaethics, which I believe was 228 of them, which I think comprised 13% of the total respondents, something around there, it went up to about 65%. So it went
Right.
up a small amount, but it did go up.
Yeah.
So you get 62% in general and then 65% for specialists.
Okay. Yeah. Um, right. So, oh, and I mean, with moral anti-realism is something like 25%. So it's not 60. Yeah, it's not like 65% moral realism and 35% anti-realism. It's
Right.
like 65% realism, 25% anti-realism, and then other people are
Yeah,
just in
with
between. It's something like that,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. So the general amount, I think it's 26% anti-realist. I don't remember what percentage there is under just the specialists in metaethics. But yeah, you have a large proportion. So this is a philosophy survey. So they give lots of alternative options, which were typically things like both, neither, some other view, often a whole bunch of unusual views. So you'll often get like 8 people said one thing, 3 people said another thing, 2 people said this other thing, one person said another, and another person said another one. And so you get this big category of everything else. And that everything else category, I think, was like 14% or something. I don't even know if the numbers quite add up. And one thing to note about this is sometimes the percentages on those surveys are higher than 100% because people can pick more than one.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was true for all of the questions, but it is true for some of them, because if you look, the percentages will add up like to 120%. So
Right.
they definitely weren't just picking one. But yeah, it's about, I would say roughly it's 2/3 people favor realism and one quarter favor anti-realism, and then the
Okay.
rest are somewhere in between.
Yeah. So, okay, we have a majority favoring realism. When you look at the experts, a majority favor realism, and so given that you should generally defer to what the experts say, you have some reason to think that realism is true.
All right, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this.
Um, I think that this is a deeply unconvincing argument. Uh, I mean, if anything goes into the E tier, I'd probably be inclined to put this one in there. Um, yeah, so I think so. First of all, when we're talking about like deferring to expert consensus, okay, like so in general, this idea of deferring to expert consensus, that seems like it's even if you were to accept that, I'm just not sure that like what we have right here is anything close to being enough of a consensus. I mean, it's not like what you have in the case of climate change, for instance, where it's like, I mean, 97. I think it's actually a lot higher than 97% now. So it might be like 99.5% of climate scientists agree on climate change. When it comes to when it comes to metaethics, though, it's like 65-27. I mean, okay, so but there's a significant portion of so-called experts who just disagree. Now, the other problem here is that there's different ways of being a moral realist. So whether or not you have a consensus is going to look. It's going to depend on like how you taxonomize these different positions. So we have moral non-naturalism and moral naturalism is like the big distinction between different types of realists, and it really isn't clear. I mean, so what like there might be somebody who is a moral naturalist, but like if you were to ask them, okay, like if it turns out that like the naturalist reduction of moral norms doesn't work, would they then become moral non-naturalists? Well, no, maybe they would just become error theorists or something. Similarly, like there might be moral non-naturalists who like their second best option would be some sort of anti-realism. I mean, so I'm not really sure that like they all, so there's a group of people who are like 65% of people will say moral realism, but like those moral realisms involve very, very different commitments, right? The commitments of a moral naturalist might be very different. So the metaphysics, the epistemology, is going to be very different whether whether you're talking about like Richard Boyd on the one hand, who's a Cornell realist, or someone like Michael Huemer, who's a non-naturalist, right? It's like, so, I mean, I'm just not sure that I would count that as a consensus in any relevant sense, because to me, like a consensus should be, like if I look at climate science, there seems to be a broad agreement about like the entities that are being postulated, and then how you find out about about what those entities are doing and how they work. There is no such agreement when it comes to metaethics. There's at least among realists. So I'm skeptical that consensus even exists in the way that would be required for this argument to even get off the ground. That's one point.
Yeah, just to give people that are hearing us talking about this some data, that same survey, the 2020 Phil Paper survey, also asked the philosophers responding to it to endorse the particular metaethical position that they favored.
Uh-huh.
And you have a roughly even split between naturalists and non-naturalists. I pulled up the data right here. So you have about, I'm just going to round up. So we have about 27% non-naturalists and then about 32% naturalist realists. And so it is very nearly split with a slight leaning towards naturalist accounts. So yeah, it is evenly split. So it's not like we go and look and it's only 5% naturalists and 55 or whatever percent realists. Non-naturalist realists. That might be still, you could say, okay, well, at least it's a little more than half. We don't have any particular position that's more than half. And one thing I think is kind of funny about this is that non-naturalists in particular will often tout the consensus in favor of their view, but their view at 26.56% is almost identical to the number of anti-realists, which is like 26.1% or something like that. So slightly lower. but the numbers are almost the same. So there's not that. So there are approximately as many, and this is a matter of like maybe less than 10 people responding to the survey. If you look at the specialists, um, for the number of philosophers responding to the survey that favored non-naturalist realism versus anti-realism, and it's not at all clear. There are certain ways in which naturalists have affinities, or like there's a sort of more in common between naturalist realists and anti-realists in some ways than there is relative to non-naturalists. So, I would actually bet most anti-realists are going to be favorable towards, if not naturalism more broadly, like a naturalist philosophical perspective in general, than the kind of sparse ontological perspectives that you and I might favor. Like, I don't even think we have the same view, but we both have the kind of what Don Loeb called it, a fondness for desert landscapes. Like, we want to keep as much crap out of our ontology as we can. And there's various ways of doing that. You have like the various monistic views, skeptical views, pragmatist views. So there's a bunch of ways where you could rule this stuff out. I'm not saying pragmatism necessarily entails that there's just a variety of options here that are not. I'm buying into the non-naturalist stuff of like mainstream analytic philosophy's super duper love of really Baroque metaphysics.
Yeah.
Like, there's a whole category of people that reject that. It's one thing I find weird when people argue against physicalism, is that they take it, if you're not a physicalist, then you have to endorse whatever weird dualist or weird metaphysical view, as if I don't have any other options.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing here. So that's one point, is that position is a kind of pseudo consensus. And I actually thought of a comparison that I don't know how well it will work, because I just thought of it now, so maybe it'll just sound weird. But imagine we're talking about the origin of life on Earth, and there are three competing accounts of how life arose on Earth, which is that it arose through biological evolution and we'll just say abiogenesis. It arose by abiogenesis, by aliens deliberately seeding Earth with life and designing humans. It's not like they just threw some bacteria here. They designed humans. Aliens design humans, or God made us.
Right.
And if you compared the three positions, it would be really weird for someone could have the "we were created" view as a super category and say both the aliens made us and God made us, and then let's say that was like 60% or 65%. It would be weird for those two groups to unify and then say the "we were created" view wins out. There's a consensus we were created relative to the organic view, because in many ways the aliens put us here. If those people say, look, aliens put us here, and let us be very explicit, it definitely wasn't God. There is no supernatural. We only believe in a natural world, and it definitely super duper wasn't God. It was some natural process. And if you say, okay, well, what if we proved it wasn't aliens? They go, oh, well, then it must have been abiogenesis. So those people have a lot in common with the abiogenesis people that they don't have in common with the God did it people. It's weird to treat them as the same category. So I don't know if that comparison, if you find
that totally makes sense, because I think that a moral naturalist could say, well, look, I don't believe in irreducible normativity. Like, irreducible normativity, yeah, I totally agree with Mackie. That's just queer, or that's unintelligible, or whatever. Like, so I don't get on board with any of that weird metaphysics. And then, like, what's my epistemology? Well, I think that we can establish that there are these naturalistic moral facts through inference to the best explanation. We can use the same sorts of methods that are used in the empirical sciences to come to moral beliefs. So someone like that, like if you were to sort of tell that person, well, actually, naturalist realism isn't going to work, would they, would they just convert to non-naturalism, or would they say, well, I guess it sucks, but it looks like I'm going to have to be an anti-realist now? I think not all of them, but a lot of them would probably kind of shift in the more anti-realist direction in that case. So yeah, I don't see a consensus here in the sense that would be required for this to work. Like, because it's like, well, okay, what am I supposed to be believing in, right? Like, when you say that there's this consensus for moral realism, so am I supposed to believe in irreducible objective moral norms, or am I supposed to believe in these naturalistic moral properties?
To draw the analogy, it'd be like if someone's like, look, we were created, it's just a question of whether aliens did it or God did it. Those are very different proposals. Why would I endorse the It's just I know we were created. It's just a question of aliens or God. That's strange because the reasons why I would favor one or the other are so different. Treating it as a kind of placeholder, it's like an undifferentiated position. It's undifferentiated between two accounts that are so different from one another. It's unclear why you would be motivated by the super category itself.
Yes.
The motivations for the aliens did it or God did it are so independent of one another. It would be weird for someone to say, "Look, I know it's one of the two." Unless they have this really strong reasons for rejecting, and maybe some, I think some would say, look, I know it's not abiogenesis. That's just nonsense. So there's probably some people that would just say that's so implausible that if God doesn't exist, then it had to be aliens. Of course, you could ask them where the hell the aliens come from.
And I mean,
But
there could be a scientific consensus that that actually that's the case, right? Like we can imagine some scientific consensus emerging that like, well, humans just, or like life on Earth just must have been designed. This actually just couldn't have arisen through an abiogenesis. In the same way, I suppose it's possible that there could emerge a consensus in philosophy that anti-realism just like it can't work for some reason. Like there's just some knockdown
right.
problem for anti. But that consensus does not exist. There, like different philosophers have different objections to anti-realism. There's no unifying consensus about what's wrong with it. So yeah.
Right. We shouldn't omit either that it might very well be the case that some non-naturalists would say the naturalist project is so ridiculous that
Yeah.
if it's not non-naturalism, it's anti-realism. I bet quite a few would say that actually.
Yeah. Yeah,
And so
I've heard
if you
them.
like,
I,
yeah, I've heard at least a couple say
yeah.
that. So that's what I'm basing that on. But I don't have like survey data. It would be interesting to do a rank order. If this one isn't true, which one would be the next one? If this one's not true, which one's the next one? And to see where people get. My guess is that anti-realism would be choice number one or two for most people.
Although we should be careful not to do what the realists just because I mean there are different anti-realists, right? There's error theory,
True.
constructivism,
Yeah, that's
non-cognitivism.
also true.
Yeah.
So this might be really hard to rank order. So you might have to break them down further because, I suspect a lot of them would be, okay, look, I'm okay with error theory, but I'm sure as hell not okay with non-cognitivism.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, I think relativism would be the lowest on the list. I think everybody
Probably.
hates relativism.
Yeah.
And I also think constructivism would do modestly well. I think a lot of people would take that as a compromise position. So I think you would have this interesting list where it would be like naturalist realism, naturalist realism, or non-naturalist realism would be the most popular, or anti-realism. Some type of it's going to be one of those. Then I think that expressivism and error theory are going to do reasonably well. I actually think expressivism, and I think this is consistent with the Phil Papers data, maybe this is why I'm saying this, would outperform the other anti-realist positions.
I was really surprised that error theory was so low because error theory's got I think it's like 5% or something. It might even be lower.
I'm looking at it now. It's
Yeah.
5.27%,
Yeah.
whereas expressivism gets 10.6. I think the reason why is that expressivist accounts have really done their best to hybridize in a way that's really conciliatory towards realist positions. So you've got quasi-realism and stuff. And I think that has inflated its appeal.
Mhm.
If this was just straight up like AJA or emotivism versus error theory, I think error theory would win.
The way it should
That's
have
not what we're dealing
stayed,
with these
the way
days.
it should have been before they went off on the wrong track, right?
That's what I would say, but
Yeah.
because I quite like what Air has to say and what Hare has to say. I don't endorse the positions outright, but I think they've been given short shrift, and I think the dispensing with them was, I think, premature and based on reasons I don't find particularly compelling.
We're sort of going a little bit off track here.
Oh,
So
that's true. Okay, so
the expertise argument. Yeah.
yeah, expertise argument.
Yeah.
So I should say, I currently have an ongoing blog series on the blog Lens Independent called The Phil Papers Fallacy. And the whole point of the blog series is to argue that we shouldn't put that much stock in what a majority of philosophers endorse or reject as far as arguments go. And the whole thing is based on raising a whole bunch of reasons why we should be not very confident. So I'll just summarize because I know I've said a lot when I get into the empirical stuff. I just tend to go like talking for 20 minutes. The basic idea is this. If you look at the demographics of the respondents to the survey, I think 48% are from the United States. The vast majority, though, are in countries with particular demographic characteristics. These are weird countries, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Empirical research shows that psychologically speaking, people from these kinds of countries, this is the United States, the UK, Australia, Canada, and then to a lesser extent, there's going to be a gradation of the degree to which weird influences and subsets of that, like democracy, industrialization, that sort of thing, have made their way around the world. But there's this sort of cluster of countries that exhibit these particular traits on average within the populations to a very high degree. Those populations, empirical research has shown, are psychologically idiosyncratic relative to the rest of the world's population. And most of the respondents to the survey are from those populations, work within those populations, and write and speak and do all their work in English, which is the sort of most prototypical, it's like the exemplar language of weird society. And so the whole point is you have a population of people that make up only about 12% of the world's population. And already there's a lot of empirical research showing they're not psychologically very similar to everybody else. And then these people are analyzing English sentences and the judgments and experiences that they've had of themselves and their colleagues interacting with people in predominantly the United States. And then they're extrapolating from that from how humans in general think. And that, I think, is highly questionable. And then there's other issues. I'll just mention one briefly, which is that if we're going to look at the consensus among experts, well, there are these things, self-selection effects. And so that same 2020 Phil paper survey, if you look at philosophers in general, most of them are atheists. I don't know, 70, 80%, something like that. So it's mostly atheists. But then if you look at philosophers that specialize in philosophy of religion, it flips. It's actually mostly theists, and it almost exactly flips in the opposite direction. Does that mean that because most specialists in philosophy of religion are theists, that this is really good evidence that theism is true? I take it not. And there's an obvious reason why. People that are disposed to believe in God are more likely to study philosophy of religion. Now, I think that this is almost certainly true. Just the same, you could imagine that people that are disposed towards the kinds of views that would incline them towards anti-realism might, one, not be particularly disposed towards studying metaethics, and then two, might not be so disposed towards studying philosophy in general. It could be that the kinds of broadly skeptical or anti-realist positions that people might be inclined towards would discourage those people from pursuing careers in analytic philosophy, because analytic philosophy, the positive positions within the field tend to take these more like ontologically profligate stances on what the world is like. And someone with a very sparse ontology might not be very interested in joining a field where they have to say, that's not real, that's not real, that's not real. Just like, you're not going to find too many cryptozoologists that are convinced there's no cryptids. It'd be really weird. They're going to run around looking for Bigfoot, and I'm convinced there's no Bigfoot. Why would they do that? I mean, they might, and there probably are a couple, but they're not going to be people that think Bigfoot's real are more likely to pursue Bigfoot. So, and I think the same thing.
I wonder if the realists might say, well, if we look at like just the last 100 years of philosophy, so like the development of analytic philosophy, it seems to be the case, although we don't have any. I don't think we have any survey data like the Phil Papers surveys, but it does seem to be the case that moral anti-realism, was the consensus for some time. Like, so from, like during the sort of like the logical positivists up to about the 1970s, it seems like people were mostly anti-realists back then. And so, I don't know, I mean, I guess they could say, well, the fact that you had mostly anti-realists in analytic philosophy, and then it kind of gradually shifted from, like the 60s and 70s, you started seeing this resurgence of realism, maybe that would go some way towards allaying this concern that there's just something about the analytic methods that, like it's people who are more inclined to realism would be more attracted to those methods or something like that.
Yeah, I think that you raise a good point there, which is that if analytic methodology were systematically inclining people towards realism or anti-realism, then we wouldn't expect that kind of change within the field. I hadn't considered that, and I think that's a good point, and I think it should lower my confidence that there's something fundamentally wrong with the method. On the other hand, one could see that within the tradition itself, that there was a development of the tradition. So you have the kind of linguistic turn, and then I see you had Wittgenstein, who had an enormous influence of ordinary language philosophy, and you had these kind of anti-metaphysical approaches that I see as, and I'm not a historian of philosophy, but I see them largely as a reaction to an attempt to graft the successes of the sciences onto philosophy and really get something out of that. And I think that part of the sort of side effect or even constitutive of that is a highly anti-metaphysical approach to philosophy. But one could see the return of realism as a kind of reorienting around the natural disposition of philosophy as a sort of autonomous discipline. So I
Yeah.
think that as philosophy has moved towards carving out, like, it used to be in the past that these fields were a lot more amorphous. It was a lot more nebulous what you were and how you did things. You have natural philosophy. But if philosophy is going to remain a functionally autonomous and distinct discipline, it needs to have its own methodological territory and it needs to have its own space of problems. And while you had these types of approaches to philosophy, positivism, ordinary language philosophy, Wittgenstein, and some of this continued on after that, that want to extirpate and purge much of what is central to the philosophical corpus. Though, I mean, I suspect that it's not the case that that trend of shifting away from that and back towards moral naturalism and then eventually moral non-naturalism, which I think was a wave that came a little bit later, more recently, maybe in the 90s, that those are sort of a self-correction towards the intrusion of a kind of anti-philosophical mindset within the field that I think is enervating and discouraging. I mean, Wittgenstein literally would tell people, like, don't do philosophy, quit and go do something else. And so a lot of those people, I suspect, did a lot. Like, I mean, keep in mind also, this was a few decades into the emergence of psychology, and you had, look, you had psychology emerging, what, in the late 1800s, but look around the same time, you have the rise and the sort of behaviorism. Again, I'm speculating off the cuff with a lot of historical speculation here where the details are going to be wrong. I'm not sure about everything, but psychology stepped onto the scene. Look what I ended up doing my discipline in, my research in. I ended up in a psychology program. And so people with my kind of hyper empirical disposition, there's a good chance that they ended up in linguistics programs, cognitive science programs, and other sorts of programs where the people with those inclinations left. And so I do think that sociologically something complicated has gone on here. But I think that the fact that, so it might not be that philosophy has selected for people with these inclinations so much as the entire academic world has selected those people towards other directions. I think something funny is going on here.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose it is worth noting that when I say, there are all these it was mostly moral anti-realist, and then there was a resurgence of moral realism around the sort of 60s and 70s. Well, at the same time, there were significant changes in analytic philosophy in general, and there was a resurgence of there was a resurgence of metaphysics in general, following people like Kripke. So, yeah, I mean, it's not just, the change didn't just happen in metaethics. Okay, yeah. So is there anything else to say about this one then? The expertise argument.
There's a couple other things to say.
There was one more. So one more point I definitely wanted to make was just so even if there was this broad consensus in favor of moral realism or some specific moral realism, I'm just not sure why I would assume that philosophers are particularly reliable at getting at the truth. So it, like, in general, when it comes to like deferring to experts, I mean, I think that the way I would look at this is, well, there are some cases where experts can sort of demonstrate their expertise with respect to specific things. So if there's somebody who is, a cancer surgeon or something, then it might be the case that he just has this long list of people that he's performed surgery on, and I can just see that those people, it's like, okay, well, they had cancer, and they went to this surgeon, like most of them lived, and most of them ended up cancer free. Okay, so that sort of thing, it's like, yeah, okay, well that demonstrates that this guy is successful with respect to the thing that matters to me, right? Like if I have cancer and I need surgery, I can check that this guy is successful with respect to the thing that matters there. And then like other examples would be things like, you know, constructing earthquake resistant buildings, right? Like if I we can just look at the engineers and architects and so on who have been successful at creating buildings that are earthquake resistant. Um, with philosophy, it's a lot more tricky though, because like the question here is, well, what is the fact of the matter in this particular case, right? Like, is moral realism true or is moral anti-realism true? So we need to show that philosophers are reliable at getting at the truth. Um, but that's not like, I mean, I'm only going to be able to assess that if I've like already myself worked through a whole bunch of philosophical arguments. And like the only way I can assess whether some philosopher is accurate at getting at the truth is if I myself have become an expert in philosophy, thought through a bunch of philosophical arguments, and then can sort of say whether or not they've come to what I consider to be the right position. But then at that point, I mean, I don't really even need to defer to experts anymore because I just would be an expert in the field. So yeah, that's pretty much where I am. Like, I don't think there's any sort of independent way of demonstrating um, that you have gotten to the truth with respect to some philosophical question.
Right. So this is in the blog series. This is where I say expertise matters, and what I argue is that while philosophers are probably experts in many respects, like experts at evaluating arguments and formal logic, and probably understanding the history of philosophy, knowing how to interpret particular philosophy. Someone might be really good at telling you what Kant actually meant in a particular article. I don't think that they've demonstrated an expertise at getting philosophical questions correct. And I make the same point you do, where what I say is that with respect to other sorts of things, engineering, being good at chess, being a good doctor, we have external means of corroborating that the people are good at what they say that they're good at. And I think that a lot of times when people appeal to philosophical expertise, they get the causality reversed. In these other cases, we consider the people experts because they have a demonstrated track record of success, whereas philosophers have not, I think, demonstrated a track record of success in the same way, at least not in any readily verifiable way. And yet they then want us to defer to their expertise and grant that they're successful. So the other cases, it's your success is what makes you an expert. And here they want to say we're experts, therefore we're successful. I'm not willing to grant that. Show that you're successful first, and then I'll consider you an expert. And so I see expertise as downstream of success, not you don't just establish expertise first and then declare that as an indicator of your success in the absence of any other way of evaluating your success. What the hell made you an expert? How do I know you're an expert? I've seen some I got to be honest, asinine responses to this where they will just say, well, they thought about it a lot. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, Christian theologians thought about Christian theology a lot. Do I have to be a Christian then? What the hell kind of answer is that? They thought about it a lot. It's a ridiculous answer. So, it's not just that they would need to demonstrate the relevant expertise. What I ultimately point to is that they need to demonstrate that they have workable methods, and it's the methods that matter. And ultimately, it's what is causing them to converge on a particular beliefs that matters. It's not merely the fact that they're converging. What if all the philosophers had a brain parasite at a conference that caused them all to agree with each other? It's not a good reason to believe what they believe. And if we found that out, I think it'd be a really weird argument, that the contagious parasitic brain debunking argument, but like it's like a logical possibility. And if we did discover it, we would go, oh shit, actually they all think of it this way because of brain parasite. Okay, well now I don't care what philosophers think. I mean, of course that's absurd, but I still want to know why they think what they do. And if they can't demonstrate that they're experts, okay, well let's look at the methods. And I don't think that the methods are very clear or reliable or good. I do want to backtrack just because I certainly don't want to say anything that I think is mistaken or incorrect. And I don't want to give the impression that I think analytic philosophy, as it's structured at any particular point in time or by its sort of intrinsic nature, disposes people towards realism. Rather, what I think is that there are more complicated sociological forces at work. And one of the points I want to make about this is, let's say that there are people that are like convinced by Wittgenstein to be quietists. I don't see that as a sustainable long-term research program that's going to persist in academic philosophy, precisely because by its very nature, if you're just like, this is a pseudo problem, this is a pseudo problem, this is a pseudo problem, I think psychologically that might just dispose people towards not wanting to persist and keep saying that all the time. And so what I think is that like the ability to argue for something and do something in the field is the kind of thing that we should expect to persist. And so this is going to naturally disincline people towards positions like mine at the very least. So I do think anti-realists that fall within the analytic tradition do persist within that space, but positions like mine, where I see much of the dialectic is like fundamentally misconceived from the outset, I feel the pressure to, and I've had people ask, why are you here? What's the point? So I do think there's something sociological going on. There might also be something dispositional or personality based. I saw recent empirical research on this, and they did not find personality features predicted people's philosophical positions. So I don't know what to make of that. But I know William James talked about this in Pragmatism, that there's these like two different philosophical mindsets. I suspect there's something to it, but I haven't seen the evidence. And then, so what was the last point I wanted to make on this? Yeah, I guess just I'm pointing more generally to there being potentially social and demographic factors, but I also think those can be fairly localized. And so I don't think it has to be analytic philosophy pushes people towards realism, but that recent trends in the field could push people towards realism, independent of whether that's representative of like what analytic philosophy does. And so I think certain popular figures at any given point in time can push the views of the field towards particular perspectives merely because some people are basically, I think, a sort of local contingent feature at any given point in time. Certain positions have better PR, right, and then they become popular for reasons unrelated to their truth. And I think realists, and especially non-naturalist realists, have had a lot of good PR in the past 30 years or so.
Yeah. You know, on this point about the like demographics and the sort of holding particular views that disincline you to pursue certain projects, I'm just thinking about my own case, because I was always quite interested in like both philosophy of science and metaethics, and I ended up pursuing more philosophy of science, right? Like that's what I did for my BA dissertation and my MA and then my PhD. It was all philosophy of science. But I know that for a while I was really interested in metaethics, and I mean I could be misremembering this. I could just be making up some rubbish, but I'm pretty sure that like part of the reason why I ended up drifting away from metaethics for a while was because I was definitely inclined to non-cognitivism, and I always hated the fact that basically the last 40 years of non-cognitivism has just been about trying to respond to the Frege-Geach problem like in a way that would be satisfying to realists. Like that whole program just seemed to me to be completely mistaken, and it's like there was no way. It was almost like there was no way into metaethics for me without dealing with that, and I just didn't want to deal with that because I thought this whole thing is just a complete waste of time. Like, and so I don't know. I mean, maybe yeah, maybe my own case would be like an example of this. Like, yeah, I mean, people will choose projects based on what else is going on in the field. That's pretty plausible.
Yeah, and to be fair, this is super duper speculative on my part. I don't have any concrete evidence for particular sociological forces at work. And if anything, what little evidence I've seen seems unsupportive and contrary to this. But I think there's something to it. Just because one or two studies doesn't show big personality differences, predict big differences in philosophical views, I don't think it points against like broader sociological forces or like the PR example that I've given, or this idea that if there's not a good project to work on, you're just going to leave. But I do think that there's something to that. I think it's just very, very difficult to demonstrate that. What I want to point to on this front is what I take to be a general lack of curiosity about the sociology of philosophy and the methodology of philosophy. Of course, there is discussion. I just finished reading a book from Williamson on philosophical methods. It's like a short introduction to something like that. Short intro to meta philosophy, maybe? I don't know. Now I'm tempted to want to go find the book. Anyway, it's the short Williamson book on methods in philosophy. Um, that got me distracted because I want to find the name of the book. I will often see in comments someone saying, "What was the name of that book?" And then I have to go figure out what the heck I was talking about like a week before, like which book it was. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked again, probably because we've been talking for a while. Where was it? Oh, right. I think that the proportion of philosophers that believe something that really matters, like why they believe it, like what causal factors are causing them to believe what they do. And we shouldn't just rely on the naive presumption that whatever the distribution is, that's because people enter the field and then they were all persuaded accordingly. We don't know,
Right.
for instance, what the base rate is. So here's one point, and I think I want to wrap up there because I think we've said a whole lot about
Yeah.
this. Imagine you're a moral realist that says, look, almost everybody, almost all ordinary people are moral realists. We could basically round up to 100%. And just for the sake of simplicity, we'll round up to 100%. And then you look at the proportion of metaethical views among philosophers, and it's only 62% realists, and it's 26% anti-realists. Okay, so what's going on there? If you think that distribution is reflective of people's responsiveness to the arguments, then it looks like nearly half of philosophers, once they started studying philosophy, renounced moral realism, and a quarter of them endorsed anti-realism. Now, does a majority in favor of realism look like evidence for realism? Because
Right.
now that kind of looks like evidence for anti-realism. I mean, you can imagine if 100% of people were theists, and then you go look at specialists in philosophy of religion, and it's 62%, and then a quarter of them are atheists. Kind of looks like studying religion is more likely to make you an atheist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
why
that's
exactly is
interesting
the
because if you go with the argument from sort of like appeals to, common sense and intuition and the face value of moral practice, there now seems to be some tension with the appeal to expertise insofar as, well, actually we've got a quarter of these experts who are anti-realists.
right? And doesn't it matter why? So what if we found out, for instance, that if you could somehow scan everyone's brain and know the disposition that they had before they started, or if they actually had a position before they started, like as an undergrad, like the day they're like starting as an undergrad and they haven't gone into their first class yet, and you could perfectly scan all of them, and you found 62% were realists and 26% were anti-realists, and then you look at the survey response. Okay, so studying philosophy has no effect on people. Now, what should we make of that? So, I mean, maybe it just indicates everybody has incorrigible starting points. There are individual differences that exist within the population already, and studying philosophy does not a damn thing to move people one way or another. Would that be evidence of realism? It's not clear to me. So, looking at the raw percentage just strikes me as ridiculous. We need to know the causal directions, like what did they think before they studied philosophy? What did they think after they studied philosophy? Which arguments did they find? Like, what factors were they responsive to that caused them to change their views? What if we find out that realists are more charismatic and persuasive than anti-realists, and that's why they're realists? Like, why people have moved towards realism. I'm not suggesting that because that seems like a desperate ad hoc, like, it's just because you guys are cooler than us or something. I'm just saying that among other factors, there could be like we don't actually know why people are realists or anti-realists, in short.
Yeah.
And unless we know why, what does it matter what the proportion is?
Right. Okay. So I said at the very beginning when we started talking about this, I was probably inclined to put this in E tier. If anything goes in E tier, I think it would be this one. And I mean, our discussion has not inclined me to move it up any further. I still want to put it in E tier.
I'm fine with it being an E tier.
Okay.
This, I mean, look, I have I have like a 1 month long where all my blog posts are dedicated specifically to talking about how much I hate this. So
Okay.
I'm fine with this being an E tier. So expertise.
I should. I mean, I guess I didn't like ask how much time you actually had today. We've been talking for 3 hours. We still have two more arguments to go. I mean, do you have time to do that? It doesn't. If not,
Yeah, I have time.
okay.
I had other stuff to do, and it's already done. So, like, too bad for me, I guess. So, I think we might as well wrap up because then otherwise, I'd feel like we had an incomplete video, and that'd be really frustrating. So, let's
Okay.
just finish it.
Yeah.
Maybe not dwell on them too much. Let's try to get through them quicker,
All
depending on what
right.
they are, though.
Well, it's the moral fixed points and Hume's ontological argument. So do you want to do them,
I
or we
gotta
don't
say,
have to? But yeah.
yeah. Do you want to give an outline? Because you had a discussion with Schaefer Landau about moral fixed points, right? Or did you cover that as your own video,
No,
or
no,
both?
no. The thing with Roche for Landau was I, I, I knew I was going to talk to Russ, and so I went back and read a load of his work, and I read all the moral fixed point stuff, and I had things to say about it. And then he presented arguments from his new book, which wasn't out yet, and so he didn't actually talk about the moral fixed point stuff. But I did make a video on it. But yeah, my discussion with Russ Schaefer Landau didn't actually cover this, so. Um, I could, yeah. So the basic idea here is, let me just check my notes. Right, yeah. So this is just the idea that like there's various moral propositions that are just conceptual truths. It is pro tanto wrong to torture somebody for fun, or it is pro tanto wrong to impose severe burdens on other people just because of their physical appearance, or it is pro tanto good to give money to charity. The thought is that um, these claims are made true just by the concepts, right? So if if somebody was to deny these claims, we would say that they have made some sort of conceptual error. It would be like saying that that this bachelor is a married man. So if you were to say that it's pro tanto good to torture somebody for fun, that would be analogous to saying that a bachelor is a married man. Um, so the way that they put this slightly more technically is um, that X is F is a conceptual truth if and only if it belongs to the essence of F, that necessarily anything that satisfies X also satisfies F. So unmarried men are bachelors. It belongs to the essence of bachelor that anything that satisfies unmarried man also satisfies bachelor. And then recreational torture is wrong. It belongs to the essence of wrong that necessarily anything that satisfies recreational slaughter also satisfies wrong. Um, so yeah, basically the idea is there are these moral fixed points. They are the conceptual truths, and we can sort of use these conceptual truths as the starting points of moral reasoning, right? So we start off with conceptual truths, and then we apply tools like conceptual analysis and inference to the best explanation to derive further moral claims. Um,
Is that
that's the
it?
idea. That's pretty much the idea, yeah.
Is there? So my initial reaction is to say, well, hold up. In what sense are they right or wrong? Like in a realist sense or some non-realist sense? Because I'm certainly going to agree that it's wrong to torture people and whatever standard things that would be obviously awful. I'm going to agree those things are bad, but I am totally comfortable with saying they're wrong. But the way in which they're bad and the way in which I say they're wrong is in an anti-realist sense.
Yeah, so it's going to be that. Well, they're going to be independent. So these are going to be truths that are independent of anybody's desires or values. Because, so let's say that you personally just desire to torture people. You personally value torturing. If you were to say, well, it's pro tanto good to engage in recreational slaughter, your claim is mistaken. You've just made a conceptual error. I think actually what they would say is that you just don't have moral concepts in that case. So, uh, like you could say the words "it is pro tanto good to torture people," but you must mean something different.
Yeah,
If you,
this just seems to
yeah,
be muddying the waters between normative ethics and metaethics in a way that looks to me to be entangling the two in a highly suspicious way.
yeah. I mean, I'm I'm in, I'm inclined to agree. So maybe I should say a bit more about like why these are supposed to be conceptual truths because they give a few. So there's four reasons. I say they. Who wrote this paper? It's Russ Schaefer Landau and Terence Cuneo and somebody else. Anyway, the idea is that if we take a claim like recreational torture is pro tanto wrong, well, there are certain features of conceptual truths in general that this claim seems to share. So a conceptual truth would be something like, unmarried men are bachelors, right? First of all, necessity. So we cannot conceive of any possible world where there are unmarried men, or like where there are bachelors who are married. Just can't conceive of that. In the same way, we can't conceive of any possible world where recreational torture is a good thing. Um, they appeal to bafflement, so it would be completely baffling if somebody were to assert that there were bachelors who were married. In the same way, it would be completely baffling if somebody were to say that recreational torture is good. We know these things a priori. We don't have to engage in empirical investigation to figure out that, you know, that unmarried men are bachelors. We don't have to engage in empirical investigation to figure out that recreational torture is wrong. So the sorts of features that you find in conceptual truths are the same features you find in these moral fixed points. I don't know if that
Yeah,
moves you at all. You
not
don't
even a
look
little bit.
convinced.
Yeah, I don't buy it. Yeah, these don't seem like conceptual truths to me. I don't know why I should think that they are.
um, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's kind of like strange about this to me is that even if I was to accept that they were conceptual truths, I'm just not sure like how that gets us to any kind of realism at all. Because, you know, you can have conceptual truths. So like it is a conceptual truth about phlogiston, that phlogiston is an elemental substance and phlogiston is released during combustion. So, you know, like if somebody was to deny those things, it would just be like it would be kind of baffling. It's like, well, no, that's just what phlogiston is. But of course, uh, phlogiston doesn't actually exist. So, so like it seems like the most that you can say is, well, if phlogiston exists, then phlogiston is something that is released during combustion, and phlogiston is an elemental substance. Um, but the mere fact that we have these conceptual truths about phlogiston, that doesn't entail anything about whether or not there really is phlogiston. Um, so in the same way, even if there were these conceptual moral truths, I don't see why that would entail that there
Yeah,
are
I'm
moral
not. I'm not
properties.
willing to grant that there are these kinds of conceptual. I mean, one thing is
Yeah.
I'm skeptical whether there are conceptual truths of this kind. Like in the case of phlogiston, I see it as stipulative. That by phlogiston, I just mean a thing that has these characteristics. By a bachelor, I just mean an unmarried man. And a proponent of the moral fixed points is welcome to say that by morally good or by some certain sort of claim, I just mean a thing that entails that it's pro tanto wrong to torture people. Well, okay, then they're stipulating that by a certain word they mean a certain concept. Like so what? So like okay, so they're using words a certain way, and those words refer to some concept.
Yeah.
There's an infinite number of so someone could come along and say, look, you got your moral facts, I got some other set of facts. I can stipulate that I believe in bloral facts, and the bloral facts require you to torture. It's pro tanto wrong, and I could stipulate that there are bloral facts of that kind, and that those seem to me like I mean they're kind of ridiculous because no one uses that language and no one thinks that way. Uh, but that's not the point. The point just is all you've given me is by some word I mean something. Okay, good for you. I don't. Why should I care? But this also does seem to me to be smuggling in normative consideration. So imagine I said you have, and you could do this with the aesthetic fixed points. So like you and I probably would agree that certain types of music or food are better than other sorts of things. So we might agree that French fries taste better than rotting garbage or something like that. They taste better than feces.
Yeah.
So French fries taste better than feces. Can I say, as one of the gastronomic fixed points, that it's pro tanto better to eat French fries than feces?
I mean, maybe
So, like,
that seems as reasonable
it
as the
seems to
moral
be
fixed points.
smuggling in
Yeah.
my gastronomic preferences, and I think what these arguments look to me like they're doing, at least at first blush, is they are banking on the fact that nobody wants to look like an evil monster by denying the normative content of the claims, and then they're smuggling the metaethical stuff in along for the ride. When if all they said is, "Hey, you're against baby torture, right? Yeah, okay, so am I." Then what more needs to be said? If you want to say it's a conceptual truth that what it means for something to be wrong is like this, there's this claim, it's built into the wrongness of the claim that baby torture is wrong, or it's built into the nature of our moral discourse that baby torture is wrong. I don't remember. Can you give me an exact phrasing? Maybe I could just modify it.
Okay, so let's see exactly
I
the
don't
way
think
that
I'm mirroring their language. page.
Yeah, the way that it's put is recreational slaughter is wrong, right? This is a conceptual truth because it belongs to the essence of wrong that necessarily anything that satisfies recreational slaughter also satisfies wrong.
Yeah, it looks like a normative claim to me, or at least a partially normative claim. And so it looks like I could do the same thing for aesthetic and gastronomic claims, and I don't see what the issue would be. And what I think gives this its rhetorical punch is the fact that virtually nobody that's going to discuss this with him is going to disagree with recreational torture being pro tanto wrong. But just imagine that the population was like 50% people that are actually pro-torture. They're going to go, of course, that's not a conceptual truth. It's actually a conceptual truth that the opposite is the case. And what's going to be the argument against that? Why are they wrong?
Well, yeah,
What's the argument?
I mean, we don't really even have to imagine this. You can just pick up like a book by the Marquis de Sade, right? So the Marquis de Sade argues in favor of brutality and torture and suffering, and he says that that's good. It's good to torture people. It's good to cause suffering. Now, my initial reaction to that is, oh right, well he has different moral views to me. It doesn't seem to me that he is conceptually deficient. I think he has moral concepts. He just has different moral views. Now, if you want to insist that, so here's the thing. I mean, you can insist that the Marquis de Sade just doesn't have moral concepts. So then I guess we're going to have to say that he has like schmoral concepts or bloral concepts or whatever it is. But then of course, I guess I just have these two conceptual systems, right? So I've got the moral system and the bloral system, and like okay, and and now I have to decide which one I favor. Looks like it's it looks like it's just going to be sort of up to me. Okay, like I happen to prefer the moral system. The Marquis de Sade prefers the bloral system. So yeah, I don't find this to be very convincing at all. But I mean, look, it seems to me when I read someone like the Marquis de Sade that he just does have moral concepts and comes to very different moral conclusions.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that we could point to ancient societies where certain practices that are considered abominable today would be considered normal and justified and right. I mean, different societies are going to have very different conceptions of what's right and wrong than we do. And you know, of course, there's persistent moral disagreement even within our society. But these just look like they're just. I think that they're leveraging the fact that they're expecting an audience not to want to be willing to deny the metaethical stuff by embedding it inside the moral stuff. So I think that this might have rhetorical force insofar as it's exploiting this thing that I've talked about, normative entanglement. So have we discussed this or?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'll give an example. So imagine there's a realist and an anti-realist having a discussion in front of an audience. Imagine you're like on like a news show and everyone's going to see this on TV. And the realist knows the anti-realist is an anti-realist, and they know that they have integrity and they don't want to lie in public. And so they say to the anti-realist, "Hey, yeah, so you know you're an immoral anti-realist, right?" And they're like, "Yeah." They're like, "Okay, well, let me ask a question for you." And they say, "Do you think it would be objectively wrong, or they could say stance independently wrong, to torture like 1 million babies for no reason at all, just for fun?" Just sadistically just torture 1 million babies just for fun. Do you think that's objectively wrong? No, what are their options? They can't, if they don't want to, they could lie and say yes, or they have to say no. What do you think the audience reaction is going to be? Is the audience going to go, "Oh, okay, well, yeah, consistent with anti-realism, of course"? No, they're going to think the person's, at the very least, less opposed to torturing babies than the person asking the question. They're going to think, "Wow, this person's a monster. What is wrong with them?" And yet, they're a monster. Why? Because they don't. I mean, you could swap out stance independently wrong. So basically, here's what's going on. They're embedding the normative claim inside the metaethical claim such that to reject the metaethical presupposition implicit in the claim as a whole, like the conjunct of the whole claim, pragmatically implies that they may, or in fact do, reject the normative claim as well, alongside the metaethical claim. And so you could reveal this by asking like a realist, let's say a naturalist realist, "Hey, do you think baby torture is magically wrong?" Well, they don't think it's magically wrong. So what do they have to say? No, I don't think it's bad. Oh, so you don't think it's wrong. So you're evil. Okay, you're pro baby torture. So it's the same thing here. All I'm saying when saying it's not stance independently wrong is that it's not stance independently wrong. I'm not telling you anything about whether I think it's wrong normatively, and I'm not telling you anything about my attitude towards it. So what you could do, and you could demonstrate this, is like you could engage in Gricean cancellation. You could say, in response to, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? No, I don't think it's objectively wrong, but I do think it's extremely wrong and repugnant, and I hate it, and I would actively work to stop people from doing it, and I'm really opposed to it, and I'm disgusted by it, and I'm just as opposed to it, if equally, if not more so, than you are. And there's no contradiction there.
Yeah.
And so that buffers you against the implication. But if you don't say all those things, you're going to look like a monster. And I think the same thing is at work in these sorts of statements, where what are you going to do? Say you don't think it's pro tanto wrong to torture people? Like, you're going to look like a monster. And so no one's going to want to say that. And I think that there's something suspicious about that.
Okay then. So all right. Well, where does this go? I'm not really very convinced by this at all. I mean, I might. I really hate the expertise argument, so I could be persuaded to put it in D, but I wouldn't put it any higher than that.
Okay, I'm inclined to put it in D instead of E for one simple reason, which is I'm going off of you giving me a description of this. I
Sure.
think I might have read the fixed points paper, but I don't remember it. So I'm pretty sure I read it, and it's like totally escaped my mind. I don't know it well enough to evaluate it, so I'll be merciful and give it a D instead of an E.
Yep. I mean, look again. I mean, I obviously I gave a very quick summary, and there's a lot more that they say. So
Right.
you know,
So maybe there's
there are
more they can
things.
say where it's very unlikely I'm going to be convinced, but I might go, okay, I see where they're going with this. This makes more sense, or this sounds more plausible than I initially thought. Same thing with deliberative indispensability.
Sure. Yeah. Um, Final one then, the last one. Now, something that is concerning me here is that something has to go in S tier, and we're now on the final argument, and
Well,
nothing's
it's
in
not
S
this
tier
one.
yet. So this,
Ontological argument is not going in S tier.
it's Michael Humer's ontological argument. um, all right then. So I'll just give a quick summary of how this works. So here we go. Premise one. Humer appeals to something that he calls the probabilistic reasons principle. If some proposition P would, if you knew it, provide a reason to do X, then having a reason to believe that P might be true also provides a reason to do X. So, like, let's say, oh, what would be a good example here? I mean, okay, well, let's say that, I'm walking in the woods and, like, I, I, I know that there's a lion in front of me. Well, that gives me a reason to stop walking along that path. We might say, well, you know, if you're walking in the woods and you come to have a reason to believe that there might be a lion on that path, right? Maybe you can't see the lion, but you can see the paw prints or something. Well, that also provides you some reason not to walk along that path. Maybe the reason not to walk along that path is no longer quite as decisive as it is in the case when you know that there's a lion there, but it still provides something, it still provides some support. So if some proposition P would, if you knew it, provide a reason to do X, then having a reason to believe that P might be true also provides a reason to do X. And then the rest of the argument goes as follows. If we knew that torturing babies was objectively wrong, this would give us a reason to refrain from torturing babies. If we knew that torturing babies was not objectively wrong, that would give us no reason to torture babies. We have some reason to believe that torturing babies is objectively wrong. And the reason why, so even if you're an anti-realist, you have some reason to believe that torturing babies is objectively wrong, because even if you're an anti-realist, you should accept that, you could be wrong, right? And I mean, like, so both of us, we're both anti-realists, but we should probably have some epistemic humility. We should accept that, yeah, I mean, we could be mistaken. Like, maybe we've, just missed something. Maybe we haven't assessed the arguments and evidence very as well as we could have done. Like, maybe the 65% of specialists who've come down in favor of realism have seen something that we haven't, seen something that we've missed. So yeah, we could be wrong. So we have some reason to believe that torturing babies is objectively wrong, and therefore, given the probabilistic reasons principle, we just straightforwardly have a reason to refrain from torturing babies. And that's the argument. So Yeah.
So this, I mean, one thing I would say is that this argument wins points for audacity.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I agree. I look. I don't want to put it in S tier, but I agree that it's not at the very bottom. Like I kind of like ontological arguments because they're sort of ballsy, and so
so
you
we're
know.
on the same page even for the rationale behind it. Yeah,
Right.
this look. One thing I could say about humor's arguments is that humor has a tendency towards being direct, straightforward, doesn't bury the lead, presents his case bluntly, and I like that about humor's approach to things, even though I disagree with humor about the realism stuff. So I'll give it that. It's and also it's clever. This is a fun paper to read.
Yeah.
So
Um, I think that for me, I mean that. So that, I suppose that the big problem with this argument for me is that I don't accept that the probabilistic reasons principle is like stance independently true. I don't think that we have. So what Hume wants to say is, well, if some proposition P would, if you knew it, provide a reason to do X, then having a reason to believe P that P might be true um, also provides a reason to do X. I think, but I don't think there are stance independent reasons in general. So I mean, in a way, I can maybe see this type of argument like connecting to something like the companions in guilt argument, where if you're inclined to think that something like the probabilistic reasons principle is just stance independently true, well, like maybe then that is going to lead you towards uh, objective moral norms via Hume's type of argument. Um, but yeah, since I just reject stance independent reasons in general, stance independent normativity in general, I don't accept that the probabilistic reasons principle is stance independently true. So I guess the argument kind of doesn't get off the ground for me. Um, so that's where I am with it.
yeah, so I would agree with that. And so it doesn't get off the ground for that reason, but the ways in which it doesn't get off the ground for me are sort of overdetermined by other considerations. And this is one where I'm not sure. I suspect we're not on the same page on this, which is that uh, I don't know what humor means by a reason. And this gets us into the territory where if he's invoking the notion of irreducibly normative reasons or the external reasons or whatever Parfit is getting at when he's talking about reasons. Uh, I don't know how to evaluate the argument because I have to be careful about how I frame this. I suspect that that the premises in this argument, at least those that invoke the notion of reasons, are not meaningful, and so like technically speaking, they're not truth apt. And so I'm not even like I did this for arguments for psychophysical harmony, where I argue that because at least one of the premises is unintelligible, technically it's not an argument because so I argued not that the argument for psychophysical harmony is wrong. I titled it. I was trying to be bold, like humor. There is no argument for psychophysical harmony.
Yeah.
You actually can't argue for it because you can't put together premises that are intelligible. And this is how I feel about this argument. But I don't want to get into that. I think it would be too long. I think that's too distinctive and idiosyncratic of my own views. And there's no way to make a case for that. But what I will say is that I am trying to build a case
Maybe,
for the
maybe,
view.
wait. Maybe you don't want to say there's no way to make a case for that. Like, that might. you just said. You just said with respect to the unintelligibility point, there's no way to make a case.
Oh, I mean within the limited time
Right.
frame that
Yeah.
we're operating under, which is this is the last one. I don't
Yeah.
mean there's no way like in general. I mean
Yeah.
there's no way like right now to do it justice and for it to be a remotely reasonable thing to do because it's a difficult case. But what I will say is I think there's something suspicious about the use of reason here, the term reason.
Hmm.
And what I will say is that I recently found that Parfit himself uh, talks about Bernard Williams denying that his concept of reason is intelligible in On What Matters Volume 2, like rather explicitly. Like Williams just outright says, yeah, I think your notion of reason is unintelligible. And Parfit goes on to talk about this and to say, yeah, like Parfit seems to indicate this is a possibility on the table that Parfit himself may misunderstand his own concepts. So Parfit says that. And one of the things I find strange about when I suggest, hey, maybe this use of reasons doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I've often had people react by saying, like, nobody thinks that. This is a ridiculous view. It's not represented in the literature. And I mean, it might be a ridiculous view, but it is represented in the literature in a sort of tangential way where it's mentioned in passing. People have said these sorts of things. What is true is that, to my knowledge, nobody has written an argument, like a paper arguing like that there's something off about this use of reasons. So maybe that's got to change. But what I would say is just to make it, to simplify it, I am not sure how to evaluate the truth status of the premises in these arguments because, at the very least, I think that the account, there's insufficient unpacking of what's meant by reason, and my strong suspicions are that there wouldn't be any meaningful account to give that would favor an especially realist characterization of reasons.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're basically on a similar page here then, because, well, I don't know if I would want to forward the unintelligibility claim. I think what I would say is just something like, I can tell you what I mean when I use the word reason, and I can tell you that when I say what I mean, realists tell me that's not what they mean. So I don't know. Do I have their concept? Like, I don't know. I mean, but certainly with respect to something like, so how does Hume put it? If some proposition P would, if you knew it, provide a reason to do X, then having a reason to believe that P might be true also provides a reason to do X. Yeah, I mean, these sorts of claims, like, this is just something I would cash out in terms of, well, there's certain like desires that I might have, and then I can think about the ways of satisfying those desires. Goals, means of satisfying goals. That's how I'm going to think about reasons here. And so, yeah, that's one issue. I suppose another issue is just that it isn't entirely obvious to me that. So, which premise is this? What is it? So, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
yeah. I mean, but he also adds the premises of the anti-torture argument are independent of interest, desires, and attitudes. So by stipulation or argumentation, I think he says he's going to argue for the particular views that he has. The account on offer is one where my reductive account or limitativist account of reasons, whatever it is, whatever my account is, that is not the account of reasons he's using. So I don't get to impute my conception of reasons into it and have the argument go through. It doesn't go through. So whatever he means by reasons, it's not what I mean, and I don't know what he means, and I suspect it's not meaningful. But even if it is meaningful, I don't know the meaning. And so how the hell am I supposed to evaluate the argument? There's still an epistemic issue here, which is that in order for me to evaluate an argument that draws on a particular set of concepts, I need to grasp the concepts.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course. That there is one other point that I think is worth making about this, which is, if so, we can ask the question: well, if you came to believe that there were objective moral facts, right, would you think so? So I could come to believe that there are objective moral facts, but then it seems like, in principle, I could come to believe that the objective moral facts are just completely unexpected. Like, I might come to believe that it's an objective moral fact that torturing babies is actually acceptable. So, of course, in that case, like, so if I recognize that, like, well, yeah, I mean, there could be objective moral facts. The objective moral facts could be completely different to my moral values. Then there's a sort of parallel of Hume's argument that leads me to the conclusion that I have some reason to torture babies. So, like, as long as I recognize that it's epistemically possible that there are objective moral facts, and it's epistemically possible that those objective moral facts are such that you ought to torture babies, then you get an exactly parallel argument to the conclusion that I already have, a reason that's like a stance-independent reason to torture babies.
Yeah, I think that might work, but there's also it immediately brings to mind for me a kind of a reverse Moorean shift, or like my own version of it, which is that if the conclusion, I mean, maybe it's not exactly Moorean shift, but if the conclusion is that I have a reason to do something, in this case, it's like to avoid torturing babies. Well, I already want to avoid torturing babies, so okay, I have a reason to do it. Great, I wasn't going to do it anyway. But if we suppose that the conclusions of Hume's argument result in my having reasons to do things that I don't want to do, like I'm inclined to pull the kind of like some kind of Humean move to say, well, sorry, not Humean move, Moorean move, is to just say, well, that's less plausible than that I just should do whatever I want to do. I mean, that would be one thing. But I'm not inclined to say that I should do what I want to do. Like, I wouldn't even say that. I would
Yeah.
have an even more deflated view than that. I would rather just say something like this. I think as a matter of descriptive fact, like as a not a normative fact, a descriptive fact, I only act in accordance with my goals and desires. And I don't desire to act in accordance with whatever external reasons there might be. I don't care about them. I don't care. If they align with my goals and interests, I would do them because they're my goals and interests and not because they're external values. And so if I were to discover, as far as I could tell, like reflecting on my own psychology, if I discovered that there were stance independent moral facts, unless it turned out that in virtue of believing them, I was thereby motivated to comply with them, in which case, of course, as a descriptive fact, I would comply with them. If they're not accompanied by this sort of necessary motivation, I'm not interested. I don't care. I'm not going to do them. And so, at the very least, what is humor then going to do? Say, okay, well, you have reasons to do things. Okay, great. I don't care. What now?
Well, maybe I mean maybe there can be facts about what you ought to do, but you just don't care about them. I
Yeah, there could be. Then
uh,
I'm going to start being
I'm
concerned about triviality here
I
because
mean
it's
moral realism. I suppose to be fair to the moral realists, right? Like they're just making a claim about the sort of metaphysics and maybe epistemology, right? They're saying, okay, there are these stance independent moral facts, but in itself that doesn't say anything about whether people will be motivated to act in accordance with them.
Oh, I agree. I don't take this to if someone says, "Hey, look, I've got a successful argument that there are stance independent moral facts, but you don't care about them." Like that doesn't mean that they're not the facts. For the same reason any district. So if someone says, "Hey, the sun is actually made out of cheese," okay, well, if that's a fact, I don't. Well, I probably would care about that, but I don't have to care about some inert descriptive fact. Like if someone tells me how many pebbles there are on Pluto, like
Right.
okay, but that's not really the issue. The issue really is that if human psychology functions in this way, it might not just be me. So if it turned out like nobody cared about the moral facts in and of themselves,
Yeah.
that would be a problem. If it turned out lots of us didn't, that would be a problem. So that there are at least like there's still cleanup work realists are going to have to do, even if they had a victory. And I think that that's worth pointing out. It's like okay, even if you got a victory here, it might be a very pyrrhic victory. You're just not going to get anything out of these facts. And the other thing I would say is I think a lot of realists, especially non-naturalists, don't want that. They want to get something out of them. And
Yeah, I mean, I
so
guess that's
they
kind of
want to be.
the motivation for non-naturalism in a way is that well, they worry that naturalism doesn't give you the oomph. It doesn't give you the like authority.
Right.
The non-natural facts are supposed to have that oomph, that force, that authority. So
Right. And there's other stuff they could say, which is that they could say, as a matter of psychological fact, most rational agents would find these facts motivating. And maybe I'm just, like there's something wrong with me. I lack empathy or I lack the concepts. And they will make those moves. But I do think that that's worth pointing out. That's not really why I reject the argument. I just think I also often think that the arguments are like, it's already overdetermined and not getting off the ground.
yeah,
Um, but then a lot of these arguments, I think, even if they went through, would still have problems anyway.
sure. So okay, well, where does this one go? I would be inclined to put this fairly high up, actually. I mean, I think that it's okay. So yeah, my feeling on this one is I like that it's quite audacious. Um, I do think that in the same way as the companions in guilt argument, it sort of raises an issue for so if people because the probabilistic reasons principle is the kind of thing where some people might just say, oh, yeah, well, I guess that is stance independently true or whatever. And if you're going to hold that sort of view, then this argument does pose some problems for you if you want to be a moral anti-realist. So, um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would I'd probably put it around like A or B. So, yeah.
I'm not convinced it's that good. Maybe I put less stock in the fact that it's audacious, so I'm more inclined towards a C. So I don't know where we want to put that.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to compromise on C. So that means that it's it's with the face value argument and the phenomenal conservatism. I don't
Yeah,
know.
let's think. Is it better than it's better than those?
I
So how
think it
about
is.
B?
Okay. Um, the problem is
And then
that
you already said A, B, so that would
yeah.
still leave us in the agreement zone.
Okay.
Okay, so that's all of them, right?
Yeah, we've done all of them, but we're left with nothing in S tier. The highest one we have is the moral convergence argument, so I guess that just has to be bumped up to S. Um,
We could just say there's no S.
it's not
There's.
acceptable.
Do you want to do like a bonus round on naturalist realism, or should we do a whole different video on that? There's like, I guess, less versions to consider or less
I mean,
arguments.
we could do one on that. I mean, I can't do that now. I've been talking for too long, and you know,
Yeah, me
I can't
too.
I can't
And
switch over
I
to
gotta have dinner.
naturalism.
It's late.
But you know what? I just want to get this list done. So here's the thing: the A tier is now empty. Um, Companions in guilt or Hume's ontological argument. Which of those is better?
Okay, hold on. So you put moral convergence in S tier?
I've shifted it up because there's nothing else.
Yeah. One thing I should say then is that means that like humor is just far and away like the winner of moral realism because he's all over the place here.
Yeah. Damn. Yeah. Um, so in
Wait, so
B,
where was this argument? This argument was B?
so Hume's ontological argument is B tier, and companions in guilt is B tier as well. Um,
So, and then phenomenal conservatism is also B tier, right?
no, that's in C tier. We
Oh, that's in C tier.
Yeah.
Okay. So then the question you're asking is, which one of those companions of guilt or ontological goes in A tier?
Yeah, that's right.
I think companions in guilt because I think it's a little clearer how it pushes the dialectic forward.
I suppose with companions in guilt as well, although we talked specifically about the epistemic companions in guilt argument, there's like 5 different ways of running this because you can appeal to epistemic norms, you can appeal to practical
Credentials.
normativity, you can yeah.
Yeah, basically what I think that I'll just say I think it successfully pushes it towards you got to be a normative anti-realist or a normative realist.
Okay.
And there's not going to be a very comfortable space for anybody in between. I think people could try to
That
cross.
is quite successful then. I mean, in terms of what that argument is setting out to do. So it's probably fair to
Right.
put it in
And
A.
so, yeah, I think that that's a powerful move. Um, and I'll give it credit for that. So I think that it should be ontological in B and companions in guilt in A.
Okay. So the overall list then, to finish it up, here's what we've got. We've got S tier is the moral convergence argument, which is that's surprising. I don't think that should be an S tier. But you know
Neither do
what?
I. I'm
This
looking at that and I was going to ask, do you want to flip these around?
Yeah, okay, fine. Oh my god, are we going to end up with oh god, no. No, the companions in
Does
guilt is
that
in
mean
S tier.
companions in guilt is the S tier argument?
Oh no.
It
I
can't be, can it?
It is. Okay, well this is what we've ended up with. Companions in
So I
guilt.
think I would want to flip them and put moral convergence in A and companions of guilt in S. Do you agree?
Yeah, well that's what I've just done. Yeah, companions in guilt in S tier, moral
Okay.
convergence in
Oh,
A.
geez. Okay, so who's the winner of philosophy then? It looks like it's Terence Cuneo and
I
then
guess. Yeah.
Humor.
Um
But Humor has A, B, and C, and he has A, B, and C.
so yeah, so just to say what the list is, right? We've got S tier, companions in guilt. A tier, moral convergence. B tier, Hume's ontological argument. C tier, the face value of moral practice and phenomenal conservatism. D tier, deliberative indispensability, Moorean shift, the moral fixed points. And then E tier, the expertise argument. So that is the list.
That one interesting and maybe like kind of a meta feature is that the expertise defense isn't an argument philosophers make, it's an argument that non-philosophers make, and it ended up as the worst argument. So maybe that is a testament to philosophers' expertise. And
Maybe.
then in virtue of that, we have to move the expertise defense up.
Oh no, right, yeah.
It's sort of self-arguing.
Yeah. Um, okay, well, yeah, well that's the list. I'll be honest with
That
you.
was a
I
lot.
mean, I really didn't want to end up saying that companions in guilt is the best argument of the lot. That's
Can you imagine any? I think the one that I would be the most comfortable with it being at the top is the ontological argument. I feel like that would be a fun winner,
yeah, I actually agree. Yeah.
but I don't think it is the winner. I just
No.
want it to be.
No, I agree. I think at the end of the day, that's probably the stance independently correct form of the list. Right.
Fair enough.
Okay. Well, I guess that's it then. I don't have anything else to say. If you have anything else you want to end on, I'll turn it over to you. But I'm done. That's it for me.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think we're going to put this on both of our channels. So if you're a subscriber on one of the channels, check out the other channel, like and subscribe. So I'm Lance Independent, you're Kane B.
That's right. Okay. All right. Well, goodbye, everybody.